14-year-old Marcus Chen sat in the juvenile courtroom with his legs swinging under the table, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. 3 families wept behind him, mothers, fathers, siblings broken by losses they would never recover from. But Marcus didn't look back. He didn't bow his head. When the prosecutor said the word victim, he let out a soft laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. Everyone froze. The judge's knuckles turned white as she gripped her pen. They all thought this was about one terrible mistake, a child who had lost control once. But they were wrong. Marcus hadn't lost control. He had perfected it, and this wasn't his first time. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now, and tell us what you think below. And this is how it all began. The investigation started with a grainy security camera frame, a figure in a dark hoodie, hands in pockets, walking away from a park trail where a body had been found 3 months earlier. Detectives thought it was random, a tragedy without a pattern. But then a second frame surfaced. Same hoodie, same gait, different crime scene. And then a third. By the time they connected the dots, Marcus had already been inside the police station twice, not as a suspect, but as a witness. Calm, cooperative, disturbingly curious. He had looked investigators in the eye and answered every question with the kind of composure that made seasoned detectives uneasy. No one wanted to believe a child could be responsible. But the evidence didn't care what anyone wanted to believe. It only cared about the truth. And the truth was about to shatter everything. The courtroom was unnaturally quiet that morning, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Marcus Chen sat at the defense table between his public defender and a youth counselor, his small frame almost swallowed by the oversized chair. He wore a button-down shirt that was too big for him, sleeves rolled up to reveal thin wrists that looked like they belonged to someone who should still be worried about homework and video games. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face scrubbed clean, and if you didn't know why he was there, you might have mistaken him for an honor student waiting to receive an award. But the families sitting in the gallery knew exactly why he was there. They knew because they had buried children, siblings, friends. And they knew because their lives had been split into before and after. And they knew because the boy sitting 10 feet away from them had taken everything. Marcus didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He sat with his back straight and his hands folded on the table, occasionally glancing around the room with the casual curiosity of someone touring a museum. When the lead prosecutor stood to outline the charges, Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if he were listening to a particularly interesting lecture. 3 counts of murder in the first degree. 3 separate incidents spanning 14 months. 3 victims who had done nothing wrong except cross paths with someone who saw them as objects rather than people. The prosecutor's voice was steady and professional, but there was an edge to it, a barely controlled anger that simmered just beneath the surface. She described each crime scene with clinical precision, walking the court through timelines and forensic findings, building a case that was already airtight before it ever reached this room. And through it all, Marcus sat perfectly still, his expression never changing. Then it happened. The prosecutor paused to take a breath, and in that brief moment of silence, she said the word that would ignite the room. Victims. The syllable hung in the air for half a second before Marcus let out a quiet laugh. Not loud, not theatrical, just a soft exhale of amusement that might have gone unnoticed if the room hadn't been so deathly quiet. But everyone heard it. The judge's head snapped up. The defense attorney's pen froze mid-note. And in the gallery, a mother who had already cried herself dry felt a new wave of rage crash over her like a physical blow. Whispers erupted. Someone gasped. A father stood up and had to be gently pulled back down by a victim advocate. The judge raised one hand, her face a mask of barely restrained fury, and the room fell silent again. But the damage was done. That single laugh had confirmed what everyone had been afraid to believe, that the boy sitting in front of them felt nothing. The defense attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent into Marcus's ear, her face pale and tight with panic. Marcus nodded, his expression shifting into something that might have passed for remorse if you didn't look too closely. But his eyes remained flat, empty of anything resembling genuine emotion. The judge watched him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing, and then she returned her attention to the prosecutor. The presentation continued. Forensic reports were entered into evidence. Timelines were displayed on a screen at the front of the room. And slowly, methodically, the full scope of what Marcus had done began to take shape. This wasn't a single act of violence. This wasn't a tragic accident or a moment of lost control. This was calculated, repeated, refined. Each crime had been slightly different, slightly more controlled, as if Marcus had been learning from his mistakes and improving with practice. The first victim had been found near a public park, a 17-year-old who had been walking home from a friend's house. The second was a 21-year-old college student discovered behind a closed shopping center. The third was a 16-year-old girl found in a residential garage just 6 blocks from Marcus's own home. Different ages, different backgrounds, different locations. The only thing they had in common was that they had all been alone, vulnerable, and unlucky enough to cross paths with someone who had already decided they were disposable. Investigators initially treated each case as isolated, random acts of violence in a city that saw its share of tragedy. But then a forensic analyst noticed something, a pattern in the wounds, a similarity in the way the bodies had been positioned, and most damning of all, a single fiber found at all 3 scenes that matched a hoodie hanging in Marcus's closet. When the arrest came, it happened quietly. No dramatic raid, no chase through the streets. Marcus was pulled out of his 8th grade math class on a Tuesday morning, escorted to the principal's office, and informed that he was being taken into custody. Witnesses said he didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer or demand to call his parents. He simply stood up, adjusted his backpack on his shoulders, and followed the officers out of the building as if he were leaving early for a dentist appointment. His classmates watched through the windows, confused and whispering, unable to reconcile the quiet kid who sat in the back row with the charges that would soon flood the news. And when the detective sat him down in the interrogation room and told him that 3 people were dead, Marcus looked up with a question that would haunt everyone who heard it. He asked, his voice calm and curious, if this meant he was famous now. His mother had been at work when she got the call. She dropped the phone twice before managing to hold it steady enough to understand what the officer was saying. By the time she arrived at the station, her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't sign the paperwork. She kept insisting there had been a mistake, that her son was a good kid, that he would never hurt anyone. But when they played the recorded interview for her, when she heard Marcus's voice describing details that only the person responsible could know, something inside her broke. She didn't collapse dramatically. She didn't scream. She simply sat down in the hallway outside the interrogation room and stared at the wall, her face blank and her eyes hollow. And when the officers asked if she needed anything, she whispered a single sentence that no mother should ever have to say. She said she didn't recognize him anymore. The boy they were describing, the boy who had done these things, wasn't the child she thought she had raised. But the evidence said otherwise. The evidence said she had been living with a monster and never knew it. The courtroom fell silent again as the prosecutor finished her opening statement. The judge looked down at Marcus, her expression unreadable, and then glanced toward the gallery where 3 families sat waiting for something that could never truly give them back what they had lost. Justice was coming, but it would arrive far too late for the people who needed it most. 6 years before the courtroom, before the arrests and the evidence and the families torn apart by grief, Marcus Chen had been just another child growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where people still waved to each other from their driveways and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. His mother, Linda Chen, worked double shifts as a nurse at the county hospital, coming home exhausted but always finding energy to make dinner and help with homework. His father had left when Marcus was 3, disappearing into a new life across the country with barely a phone call to mark the years that followed. Linda raised Marcus alone, and she did it with a fierce pride that bordered on defiance. She would tell anyone who listened that her son was special, that he was smart and thoughtful, and destined for something great. She kept a photo album filled with snapshots of birthday parties, school awards, and science fair ribbons. In every picture, Marcus smiled dutifully at the camera, his expression pleasant but somehow distant, as if he were watching the moment from somewhere outside himself. Teachers at Marcus's elementary school described him as unusually bright, the kind of student who absorbed information effortlessly and always turned in perfect assignments. But they also noted something else in their private evaluations, observations that were filed away and never quite acted upon. Marcus never seemed to connect with other children. He didn't laugh at jokes or cry when he fell on the playground. During group activities, he would watch the other kids with a clinical detachment, studying their reactions the way a scientist might observe lab specimens. When a classmate's pet hamster died, and the entire class gathered to comfort the crying child, Marcus stood at the edge of the circle with his hands in his pockets, his face blank and unmoved. One teacher pulled Linda aside during a parent conference and gently suggested that Marcus might benefit from seeing a counselor, that his emotional responses seemed atypical for a child his age. Linda had smiled politely and thanked the teacher for her concern, but she never made the appointment. She told herself that Marcus was just introverted, that he showed his feelings differently, that the world was too quick to label any child who didn't fit a narrow definition of normal. The warning signs accumulated slowly, like snow building on a branch that hasn't yet realized it's about to break. When Marcus was 9, a neighbor's cat went missing and was later found near the drainage ditch behind the playground. Its body arranged in a way that suggested something more deliberate than a simple accident. No one could prove anything, and Linda dismissed the sideways glances and whispered suspicions as small-town gossip from people with too much time on their hands. When Marcus was 10, money started disappearing from Linda's purse. Never large amounts, just enough that she thought she might be misremembering her own spending. When she finally confronted Marcus about it, he looked her straight in the eye and denied it with such convincing sincerity that she felt guilty for even asking. The money kept disappearing. She stopped keeping cash in the house. When Marcus was 11, a classmate accused him of pushing her down the stairs at school, but Marcus provided an alibi so detailed and reasonable that the principal apologized to Linda for the misunderstanding. The girl changed schools shortly after. Linda defended her son at every turn because that's what mothers do. She told herself that he was misunderstood, that other kids were jealous of his intelligence, that adults projected their own fears onto children who didn't perform emotions in the expected ways. She worked extra shifts to pay for enrichment programs and tutoring, determined to give Marcus every opportunity to succeed. She hung his honor roll certificates on the refrigerator and bragged about his test scores to her coworkers. She loved him fiercely and completely, the way a parent loves a child they have fought the world to protect. But love, no matter how fierce, cannot change what someone fundamentally is. Love cannot rewrite the architecture of a mind that processes other people as objects rather than souls. Linda loved her son, but she never truly knew him. She saw what she wanted to see, and she ignored everything else until ignoring it was no longer possible. By the time Marcus entered middle school, he had learned to mimic the emotional responses that others expected from him. He practiced expressions in the bathroom mirror, studying the way his face moved when he forced a smile or arranged his features into concern. He learned which phrases made adults relax and which behaviors earned him trust. He became exceptionally good at reading people, at understanding what they wanted to hear, and reflecting it back to them with perfect precision. To his teachers, he was respectful and diligent. To his mother, he was loving and grateful. Now, to the few classmates who tried to befriend him, he was just awkward enough to seem harmless, but not so strange that they avoided him entirely. He moved through his days like an actor playing a role, always aware that he was performing, always calculating the next move. And beneath the performance, beneath the careful mask, something dark and patient was waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. The guidance counselor at Marcus's middle school was the only person who came close to seeing through the facade. Her name was Dr. Patricia Odom, and she had 20 years of experience working with troubled youth. She called Linda in for a meeting during Marcus's 7th grade year, sitting across from her in a small office filled with motivational posters and stress balls. Dr. Odom chose her words carefully, explaining that while Marcus's academic performance was excellent, she was concerned about his social-emotional development. She described incidents where Marcus had shown a troubling lack of empathy. A classmate who had been injured during gym class, while Marcus watched with what the teacher described as fascination, rather than concern, a group project where Marcus had systematically manipulated other students into doing his work while taking credit for the results. Dr. Odom said something that Linda would remember later, years later, when it was far too late to matter. She said that Marcus didn't seem to feel consequences the way other children did, that he understood rules intellectually but didn't internalize them emotionally. She said it gently, almost apologetically, because she knew how hard it was for parents to hear that their child might be fundamentally different in ways that couldn't be fixed with love or therapy or time. Linda listened politely and thanked Dr. Odom for her concern, but as she drove home that afternoon, anger simmered in her chest. She was tired of people judging her son, tired of educators who wanted to slap labels on any kid who didn't fit their textbook definitions of normal. Marcus was quiet. Yes. He was different. Yes. But different didn't mean dangerous. Different didn't mean broken. She pulled into the driveway and found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, his pencil moving steadily across the page in neat, controlled lines. She asked him how his day was. He looked up and smiled, and it was such a warm, genuine smile that her doubts evaporated instantly. She made his favorite dinner that night, spaghetti with garlic bread, and they ate together while Marcus told her about a book he was reading for English class. He seemed so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that Linda convinced herself everyone else was wrong. She was his mother. She knew him better than any teacher or counselor ever could. She thought she was raising a survivor, a kid who would overcome the odds and make her proud. She never suspected that she was raising something else entirely, something that had learned to hide in plain sight while quietly planning its next move. The truth was living under her roof, sleeping in the room down the hall, and she wouldn't see it until the police put handcuffs on her son and led him away in front of news cameras that broadcast her shock and disbelief to the entire city. The first victim was a 17-year-old named Daniel Marsh, who loved skateboarding and old hip-hop records and had just been accepted to community college with plans to study graphic design. He was walking home from his best friend's house on a Thursday evening in late September, cutting through Riverside Park because it shaved 10 minutes off his route, and he had promised his mother he would be home by 9. The park was mostly empty that time of night, just the occasional jogger finishing a last lap before dark, and a few dog walkers letting their pets run off leash in the fading light. Daniel had his headphones in and his hood up against the autumn chill, moving along the gravel path that wound through a grove of oak trees toward the residential streets on the far side. He never made it home. His mother called his phone at 9:15 when he didn't walk through the door. She called again at 9:30, and then again every 5 minutes until midnight, her panic rising with each unanswered ring. By morning, she was at the police station filing a missing persons report with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They found Daniel's body 36 hours later in a shallow ravine just off the main path, partially hidden by fallen leaves and underbrush. A woman walking her golden retriever noticed the dog pulling insistently toward the tree line, barking in a way that made her uneasy enough to call it in. The responding officers knew immediately that this wasn't an accident or a medical emergency. Daniel had been attacked with a blade, multiple wounds that spoke of deliberate intent rather than defensive panic. The medical examiner would later determine that the attack had been swift but not frenzied, controlled rather than chaotic. Whoever did this had known where to strike and had taken their time despite the risk of being seen. The crime scene technicians worked methodically, photographing everything, collecting samples, marking evidence with small yellow flags that dotted the ground like grim flowers. They found Daniel's phone a few feet from his body, screen shattered but still powered on. They found his wallet untouched in his back pocket, ruling out robbery as a motive. And they found something else, faint impressions in the soft earth near the body, footprints that suggested someone had stood there for several minutes after Daniel had stopped moving. The investigation began with the usual protocols. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that Thursday night. They pulled security footage from businesses along the streets surrounding the park, reviewing hours of grainy black and white video in hopes of catching a glimpse of Daniel or whoever had followed him. They interviewed his friends, his family, his teachers, searching for any hint of conflict or threat that might explain why someone would target a kid who, by all accounts, was well-liked and drama-free. Every lead seemed to evaporate before it could solidify into anything useful. No witnesses came forward, no enemies emerged from the background checks. The footage showed Daniel entering the park alone, but the cameras didn't cover the interior paths where his body had been found. The case started to cool almost immediately, not from lack of effort, but from lack of direction. Without a clear suspect or motive, the detectives were left building theories on top of assumptions, chasing shadows that never materialized into solid evidence. Then Marcus appeared. He walked into the police station 4 days after Daniel's body was discovered, accompanied by his mother, who looked confused about why they were there. Marcus told the desk sergeant that he might have information about the kid who was killed in the park. He was calm and articulate, explaining that he often rode his bike through Riverside in the evenings and had been there the same night Daniel went missing. An investigator brought Marcus into an interview room, offered him water and a snack, and asked him to describe what he had seen. Marcus sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture relaxed, and recounted his story with impressive detail. He said he had been near the Oak Grove around 8:30 and had noticed someone walking alone with headphones in. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after seeing the news reports, he realized it might have been Daniel. He said he wanted to help if he could, that it was terrible what had happened, that his mother had taught him to always do the right thing. The detective thanked him, took down his contact information, and walked him and his mother back to the lobby. The interview should have been routine, just another name added to the list of people who had been in the area that night. But one of the detectives saw a veteran named Sarah Morales with 15 years on the force and instincts that had solved more cases than she could count, felt something off about the interaction. She couldn't put her finger on it exactly, just a subtle wrongness in the way Marcus had told his story. His details had been too precise, his demeanor too controlled for a kid who was supposedly nervous about talking to police. Most teenagers came in either scared or trying to act tough, but Marcus had been neither. He had been perfectly calibrated, hitting every note of concerned citizen without ever actually seeming concerned. Detective Morales made a note in the case file, flagging Marcus as someone to follow up with, but not as a suspect, just as someone who might have seen more than he realized. She pulled the security footage from a convenience store 2 blocks from the park entrance and found Marcus on camera at 8:45 that evening, buying a bottle of water and a candy bar, his clothes clean and his manner unremarkable. Nothing about the footage suggested he had just committed violence. He looked like any other kid stopping for snacks on his way home. The forensic team continued processing evidence from the scene. They lifted several partial fingerprints from Daniel's phone, most of them too smudged to be useful, but one clear enough to run through the database. It came back with no matches. Whoever left it wasn't in the system. They collected fiber samples from Daniel's clothing, finding traces that didn't match anything he owned. The fibers were consistent with a common cotton-polyester blend, on the kind used in thousands of hoodies and jackets sold at every department store in the country. They swabbed for DNA under Daniel's fingernails but found nothing, suggesting either that he hadn't been able to fight back or that his attacker had been careful to avoid leaving biological evidence. The knife was never recovered. Detectives theorized it had been disposed of in a dumpster or storm drain somewhere it would never be found. Every piece of evidence felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit with the others, and without a clear picture of what they were building toward, the case began to drift into the cold file territory that every investigator dreaded. Daniel's family held a vigil in Riverside Park 3 weeks after his death. Hundreds of people showed up, carrying candles and photos, filling the evening air with songs and prayers and memories of a kid who had been loved and would be desperately missed. The local news covered it, cameras panning across the crowd, while reporters spoke in hushed tones about senseless tragedy and community grief. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering with his mother, holding a candle and watching the proceedings with the same mild curiosity he brought to everything. When a reporter approached and asked if he had known Daniel, Marcus shook his head and said it was just sad that something like this could happen so close to home. The camera captured him for 3 seconds before moving on to someone else, and in those 3 seconds, Marcus looked like exactly what everyone wanted to believe he was. Just another kid shaken by violence, trying to make sense of a world that sometimes didn't make sense at all. No one noticed the way his eyes remained flat, even as his face arranged itself into an expression of sympathy. No one realized they were standing next to the person responsible. And Marcus walked home that night knowing he had gotten away with it, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with remorse and everything to do with the certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him. He had done the unthinkable, and the world had looked right past him. It was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last. 5 months passed before the second body was discovered, long enough that most people had stopped thinking about Daniel Marsh except as a tragic headline that had briefly dominated local news before fading into memory. The detectives assigned to his case still reviewed the file periodically, hoping some new piece of information would emerge. But leads had dried up completely. The investigation remained technically open, filed under unsolved homicides, waiting for the kind of break that might never come. Life in the city moved forward because that's what life does, absorbing tragedy and carrying on with the relentless momentum of routine. Parents still sent their kids to school. People still went to work and came home and complained about traffic. Daniel's family grieved privately, his mother unable to walk past his empty bedroom without feeling her chest tighten. But even their pain had been forced into the background of daily survival. No one was expecting history to repeat itself. No one was watching for patterns that hadn't yet revealed themselves. And in that gap between awareness and reality, Marcus was already planning his next move. The second victim was named Tyrell Johnson, a 21-year-old who worked part-time at an electronics store while taking night classes at the community college. Tyrell had dreams of becoming a sound engineer, spending his free time mixing tracks in a makeshift home studio and posting beats online that were starting to gain modest attention. He was quiet and focused, the kind of person who kept his circle small and his goals clear. On a cold February evening, Tyrell finished his shift at 9 and started the walk to the bus stop 3 blocks away. The shopping center where he worked was mostly empty by that hour, stores closing up and employees filtering out to their cars under the orange glow of parking lot lights. Tyrell took a shortcut through the rear service alley, a route he had walked dozens of times because it cut 2 minutes off his commute, and the bus ran on a schedule that didn't wait for anyone. Security cameras at the back entrance of the electronics store captured him leaving at 9:07, earbuds in, hands in his jacket pockets, moving with the easy stride of someone who had no reason to expect danger. He never made it to the bus stop. When Tyrell didn't show up for class the next evening, his professor marked him absent and thought nothing of it. Students missed sessions all the time. When he didn't report for his shift the following day, his manager tried calling and left 2 voicemails that went unanswered. It wasn't until Tyrell's roommate filed a missing person report 36 hours later that alarm bells started ringing. The responding officer took the report and ran Tyrell's information through the system, noting that he had no history of disappearing, no pattern of erratic behavior, nothing to suggest he would simply vanish without telling anyone. The case was assigned to a missing persons unit, but before they could begin a serious search, a maintenance worker at the shopping center found Tyrell's body behind a row of dumpsters in the service alley, partially concealed by cardboard boxes and plastic sheeting. The worker stumbled backward, fumbling for his phone, his hands shaken so badly he could barely dial. The police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the alley and calling in the same crime scene unit that had processed Daniel Marsh's murder 5 months earlier. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Tyrell had been attacked with a blade, multiple wounds delivered with controlled precision rather than wild panic. His wallet was still in his pocket, untouched, ruling out robbery. His phone was found a few feet away, screen cracked but functional. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting the attack had been swift and overwhelming, giving him no time to fight back. The medical examiner noted the angle and depth of the injuries, comparing them mentally to another case that shared the same clinical efficiency. When the forensic reports landed on Detective Morales' desk 2 days later, she spread them side by side with Daniel Marsh's file and felt ice settle in her stomach. The wound patterns were nearly identical. The post-mortem positioning of the bodies showed the same deliberate arrangement. Fiber evidence collected from Tyrell's clothing matched the unidentified samples from Daniel's case. The same cotton polyester blend, the same dye lot, the same everything. This wasn't coincidence. This was repetition. Someone had killed twice, and they had done it the same way both times. Detective Morales called an emergency meeting with her supervisor and the lead investigator from Daniel's case. They laid out the evidence on a conference room table and acknowledged what none of them wanted to say out loud. They were looking at a serial pattern. 2 victims with no apparent connection to each other, killed months apart in different parts of the city, but linked by forensic evidence that couldn't be explained away. The media hadn't picked up on the connection yet, and the department wanted to keep it that way to avoid public panic and to prevent the suspect from knowing how much the police had figured out. A task force was quietly assembled, pulling resources from multiple units to cross-reference every detail from both crime scenes. They built timelines and maps, searched for geographical overlaps, interviewed everyone who had known either victim, searching for some thread that might connect them. But Daniel and Tyrell existed in completely different orbits, different ages, different schools, different friend groups, different neighborhoods. The only thing they had in common was that they had both been alone and vulnerable when someone decided they were easy targets. The task force reviewed security footage from both locations, looking for anyone who appeared in the vicinity of both crimes. It was tedious work, hours of watching grainy video trying to spot a face or a vehicle that showed up twice. They found nothing conclusive, just the usual flow of anonymous people moving through public spaces with their heads down and their minds elsewhere. Then someone noticed a figure in a dark hoodie appearing on cameras near both scenes. Once at the convenience store near Riverside Park the night Daniel died, and again at a gas station across from the shopping center approximately 40 minutes before Tyrell's estimated time of death. The footage was too poor to make out facial features, and hoodies were so common they might as well be invisible. But it was something. The figure moved with a casual confidence, unhurried and unremarkable, blending into the background noise of urban life. Detectives flagged the images and added them to the growing file, hoping someone might recognize the gait or the build, but knowing it was a long shot at best. Marcus watched the news coverage from his living room couch, his mother working a late shift at the hospital, leaving him alone with the glow of the television and the quiet hum of his own thoughts. The reporters talked about a second tragedy, another young life cut short, another family destroyed by senseless violence. They didn't mention a connection to Daniel Marsh. They didn't use the word serial. But Marcus could read between the lines. He could see the carefully chosen language, the way the police spokesman deflected questions about whether the cases were related. Marcus smiled to himself, a private expression that never reached his eyes. They were starting to see the pattern, but they weren't close to seeing him. He had been careful, meticulous even, varying his approach just enough to avoid creating an obvious signature while maintaining the elements that satisfied something deep inside him. The planning, the execution, the aftermath, it was all a process that required intelligence and discipline, qualities Marcus knew he possessed in abundance. He felt no guilt about Tyrell, no more than he had felt about Daniel. They had simply been there, available, and Marcus had needed to feel that surge of power that came from complete control over another person's existence. At school the next day, Marcus participated in a moment of silence that the principal called for Tyrell Johnson. Even though Tyrell hadn't attended that school and most of the students had never heard of him before, his death made the news. Marcus bowed his head with everyone else, his face appropriately solemn, his hands clasped in front of him. A girl in the row ahead was crying softly, overwhelmed by the general atmosphere of grief, even though she had no personal connection to the victim. Marcus watched her shoulders shake and felt nothing except a mild curiosity about why people expended so much emotional energy on strangers. After the moment ended, classes resumed and life continued, and Marcus moved through his day with the same careful performance he always gave. He answered questions in English class, turned in a math assignment early, ate lunch at his usual table with 2 other kids who tolerated his presence without particularly liking him. No one looked at him and saw a threat. No one suspected that the quiet boy who always did his homework and never caused trouble was the reason 2 families would never be whole again. Detective Morales couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something obvious, some detail hiding in plain sight that would crack both cases wide open if they could just see it clearly. She reviewed witness statements again, including the brief interview with Marcus Chen from 5 months earlier. He had been helpful and cooperative, a concerned citizen doing his civic duty. But something about that interview still bothered her, a dissonance she couldn't quite name. She pulled the convenience store footage from the night of Daniel's murder and watched Marcus by his water and candy bar, studying his body language and his movements. He seemed relaxed, ordinary, forgettable. She made a note to follow up with him, to ask if he remembered anything else from that evening, but it was low priority compared to the dozens of other leads the task force was chasing. Marcus Chen was just a witness, a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had tried to help. There was no reason to think he was anything more than that. Not yet. But the evidence was starting to accumulate like puzzle pieces scattered across a table, and soon someone would notice that they all pointed in the same direction. Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that made people forget about winter and start planning barbecues and weekend trips to the lake. The city felt lighter somehow, as if the longer days and blooming trees could wash away the darkness that had settled over 2 unsolved cases. The task force continued working through their evidence, but momentum had slowed as leads went nowhere and the trail grew colder with each passing week. Detective Morales still woke up thinking about Daniel Marsh and Tyrell Johnson, still carried their case files in her mind like unwelcome passengers. But the department had other crimes demanding attention, and resources could only be stretched so thin. The public had moved on, their brief outrage and fear absorbed back into the normal anxieties of daily life. Parents still warned their kids to be careful walking alone at night, but the warnings had become routine rather than urgent, background noise in a world full of potential dangers that most people never actually encountered. Marcus Chen turned 14 in April, on a birthday celebrated with cake and a few modest gifts that his mother saved up to buy. He smiled and thanked her and seemed perfectly content, just another teenager navigating the complicated transition toward adulthood. No one knew he was already planning his next move. The third victim was 16-year-old Emily Vasquez, a sophomore at Lincoln High who played varsity soccer and volunteered at an animal shelter every Saturday morning. She was bright and outgoing, the kind of person who remembered everyone's name and always had a kind word, even for kids who sat alone at lunch. Emily lived 6 blocks from Marcus's house in a neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and kids still played street hockey until dark. On a Saturday evening in late April, Emily finished her shift at the shelter and texted her mother that she was walking home, maybe stopping at a friend's house on the way. Her mother replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder to be home by 8 for dinner. Emily sent back a heart and started the familiar walk through streets she had traveled hundreds of times, her shelter volunteer shirt still on, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She never arrived at her friend's house. She never made it home for dinner. And when 8 o'clock came and went without Emily walking through the door, her mother called her phone and got voicemail, called again and got voicemail, and by 8:30 was in the car driving the route Emily would have taken, her heart pounding with a dread that proved entirely justified. Emily's body was discovered in an open garage behind a house that had been vacant for 3 months while the owners sorted out an estate sale. A neighbor walking his dog noticed the garage door was partially open, which was unusual since the property had been secured and empty. He approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. And then he saw her lying on the concrete floor in a position that made it immediately clear she was beyond help. He backed away, fumbling for his phone, his voice shaking as he gave the address to the emergency dispatcher. Police arrived to find a scene that was devastatingly familiar to anyone who had worked the previous 2 cases. Emily had been attacked with a blade, the wounds precise and controlled, delivered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Her backpack was still on her shoulder. Her phone was on the ground beside her, the screen showing 3 missed calls from her mother. And most significantly, she had fought back. Her right hand bore defensive cuts where she had tried to protect herself, and there were skin cells under 2 of her fingernails where she had managed to scratch her attacker. For the first time, the killer had left biological evidence behind. The crime scene team processed the garage with meticulous care, knowing this might be the break they had been waiting for. They photographed every inch of the space, collected blood samples, swabbed under Emily's nails, and bagged trace evidence that included several fibers consistent with the same hoodie material found at the previous scenes. They lifted fingerprints from the garage door handle and the light switch, hopeful that one might belong to someone other than the property owners. The medical examiner arrived and carefully documented Emily's injuries, noting the defensive wounds that told a story of desperate resistance. This victim had seen the attack coming, had tried to fight, had struggled for her life in a way that the previous victims hadn't been able to do. That struggle had cost Emily everything, but it had also given investigators something invaluable. DNA evidence that could identify her killer if they could just figure out who to test it against. Detective Morales stood at the entrance of the garage, looking down at Emily's body, and felt rage burn through the professional detachment she usually maintained. 3 victims now, 3 families destroyed. And whoever was doing this was still out there, still walking around free, still capable of doing it again. The connection between all 3 cases was undeniable now. The task force held an emergency meeting that night, bringing in the FBI to consult on what was clearly a serial case. They laid out the evidence in chronological order: Daniel Marsh in September, Tyrell Johnson in February, Emily Vasquez in April. Different victims, different locations, but identical methodologies. The killer was using the same weapon or type of weapon, targeting people who were alone and vulnerable, showing no remorse or hesitation. The FBI profiler noted the escalating frequency, the gaps between kills getting shorter, suggesting the perpetrator was gaining confidence or becoming less able to control their urges. They discussed the possibility of a much older suspect, on someone with the physical capability and emotional detachment to commit these acts, but the profiler also acknowledged that age wasn't always a reliable indicator. Juvenile offenders, particularly those with certain psychological profiles, could be just as calculated and dangerous as adults. The most promising lead was the DNA evidence from Emily's fingernails. Once processed, it would be run through every database available, and if the killer was in the system for any reason, they would have a name within days. Marcus learned about Emily's death the same way everyone else in the neighborhood did, through a cascade of text messages and social media posts that spread the news faster than any official announcement. He was in his room when his phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends and classmates sharing the information with a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Marcus read through the messages with his usual calm, processing the fact that Emily Vasquez, a girl he recognized from seeing around the neighborhood, was dead. He felt a flicker of irritation, not because of Emily herself, but because of the complication she represented. She had fought back harder than he had anticipated, and he had been forced to finish things quickly and leave without his usual careful cleanup. There had been a moment during the struggle when her nails raked across his forearm, drawing blood, and he had pulled away instinctively before regaining control. He looked down at his arm now, at the 3 parallel scratches already scabbing over, and realized what they meant. He had left something behind. For the first time since this all started, he had made a mistake that could lead directly back to him. The realization should have terrified him, but instead Marcus felt something closer to exhilaration. The stakes had increased. The game had become more interesting. He went to the bathroom and examined the scratches under the fluorescent light, considering his options. The DNA under Emily's nails would take time to process and even longer to run through databases. Marcus wasn't in any system. He had never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, never given a sample for any reason. As long as he stayed off the radar, the evidence was just data without a match, meaningless without something to compare it to. He washed the scratches carefully, applied antibiotic ointment, and covered them with a long-sleeved shirt. When his mother came home from her shift an hour later, exhausted and heartsick over the news about Emily Vasquez, Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. Linda hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by the fear that every parent in the neighborhood was feeling, the terror that their child could be next. She told Marcus he needed to be careful, to never walk anywhere alone, to always let her know where he was. Marcus hugged her back and promised he would be safe, his voice reassuring and gentle, everything a worried mother needed to hear. 2 days later, Marcus was at school when 2 detectives walked into the principal's office and asked to speak with him. They weren't there to arrest him. Not yet. They were canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing anyone who lived within a half-mile of the crime scene, collecting statements and looking for witnesses who might have seen something unusual that Saturday evening. Marcus was escorted to a small conference room where Detective Morales and her partner waited with notepads and tired eyes. They asked him routine questions about where he had been on Saturday, whether he knew Emily, whether he had noticed anyone suspicious in the area. Marcus answered calmly and cooperatively, explaining that he had been home most of the day, had gone for a bike ride around 5 in the afternoon, and had returned home by 6:30. He said he knew who Emily was, but didn't really know her personally, just someone he had seen around. He expressed appropriate sadness about what had happened, calling it scary and unbelievable. Detective Morales watched him carefully as he spoke, looking for the same dissonance she had noticed during their first interview months earlier. Something about Marcus Chen bothered her, a quality she couldn't quite articulate, but felt in her gut. His answers were too smooth, his affect too controlled, his willingness to help just slightly too eager. When the interview ended, Detective Morales thanked Marcus for his time and walked him back to class. As she watched him disappear down the hallway, she turned to her partner and said something that would prove prophetic. She said that kid was either the most helpful witness they had ever encountered or something else entirely, and she couldn't figure out which. Her partner shrugged and suggested they move on to the next interview. But Morales made a mental note to pull Marcus's file again, to look more closely at his connection to all 3 crime scenes. It was a loose connection, circumstantial at best, but her instincts were screaming that they were missing something important. That same afternoon, the DNA results from Emily's fingernails came back from the lab. The sample was clean and complete, viable for comparison. It was run through CODIS, the National DNA Database, searching for a match among millions of profiles collected from convicted offenders across the country. The system churned through the data and came back with no hits. Whoever had killed Emily Vasquez, Daniel Marsh, and Tyrell Johnson had never been arrested before. They were a ghost in the system, invisible until something brought them into the light. Detective Morales stared at the negative result on her computer screen and felt the case slipping further from her grasp, not knowing that the answer was already in her notes, just waiting for someone to see the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The interrogation room at the Juvenile Detention Center was designed to be less intimidating than its adult counterpart, with softer lighting and chairs that didn't have restraint rings bolted to the floor. But the purpose was the same, to extract truth from people who had every reason to hide it. Marcus sat across from 2 detectives and a forensic psychologist, his hands folded calmly on the table, his expression attentive and cooperative. This was 3 weeks after Emily's murder. After the DNA evidence had finally been matched to Marcus through a process that began with a seemingly unrelated break in the case. A tip from a classmate who had noticed Marcus's scratches and remembered seeing him near Emily Street that Saturday evening had given detectives enough probable cause to request a DNA sample. Marcus had agreed without hesitation, confident in a way that surprised even his court-appointed attorney. He had looked Detective Morales in the eye and said he wanted to help, that he had nothing to hide, and he let them swab the inside of his cheek with the calm of someone who believed he was untouchable. When the results came back as a perfect match to the DNA under Emily's fingernails, the arrest happened within hours. Now Marcus sat in custody, charged with 3 counts of murder, and the investigators were trying to understand what they were dealing with. The psychologist, Dr. Raymond Chen, no relation, had spent 30 years evaluating violent offenders and had seen the full spectrum of human darkness. He began with standard questions, establishing baseline responses and building rapport. Marcus answered each question thoughtfully, his vocabulary sophisticated for his age, his manner polite almost to the point of being charming. Dr. Chen asked him about his childhood, his relationship with his mother, his experiences at school. Marcus described a normal life, unremarkable in every way, with no trauma or abuse or triggering events that might explain what he was accused of doing. He spoke about his mother with what sounded like genuine affection, praising her work ethic and sacrifice. He talked about school as a place he tolerated, but didn't particularly enjoy. Everything he said sounded reasonable, even mundane, and that was precisely what made it so disturbing. There was no emotional depth beneath his words, no real connection to the experiences he described. He was reciting information rather than sharing memories. Dr. Chen shifted to more direct questions about the charges. He explained that the DNA evidence was conclusive, that denying involvement was pointless, and that the goal now was to understand why these events had occurred. Marcus listened patiently, his expression never changing, and then he did something that made everyone in the room go still. He smiled. Not a nervous smile or a defensive one, but a small, satisfied expression that suggested he was pleased to finally have an audience that understood him. He asked Dr. Chen a question in return, his voice curious and conversational. He asked if they thought he was sick, if they were looking for some psychological label to explain him. Dr. Chen responded carefully, saying they were trying to understand his perspective, his thought process during the events in question. Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense, and then he began to talk. He didn't confess exactly, not in the legal sense, but he spoke in hypotheticals that left no doubt about what he had done. He described a person, theoretical of course, who might commit such acts out of curiosity rather than anger or hatred. A person who wanted to know what it felt like to have complete power over another human being, to see the moment when life became non-life. He spoke about control and planning, about the intellectual challenge of executing something complex without getting caught. He used words like interesting and educational to describe scenarios that involved human suffering and death. The detectives exchanged glances, recognizing what they were hearing. This wasn't a confession born of guilt or a desire for redemption. This was a performance, Marcus showing them exactly what he was while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to protect himself legally. Dr. Chen asked about empathy, whether Marcus ever thought about the victims as people with families and futures and pain. Marcus tilted his head, considering the question with what appeared to be genuine thought. He said he understood intellectually that other people experienced emotions, that they valued their lives and felt fear and sadness. But understanding something intellectually wasn't the same as feeling it personally. To Marcus, other people were fascinating in the same way that complex machines were fascinating, interesting to observe and study, but not inherently valuable beyond their function in his experience. He said this without malice or defensiveness, simply stating what he believed to be true. The psychological evaluation that Dr. Chen compiled over the following weeks painted a picture that was both clear and chilling. Marcus exhibited classic markers of severe antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic and psychopathic features. He demonstrated grandiose self-perception, believing himself intellectually superior to peers and authority figures. He showed no capacity for genuine empathy or remorse, no emotional connection to the harm he had caused. He understood rules and social expectations on a cognitive level, but felt no internal obligation to follow them. He was capable of mimicking appropriate emotions when it served his purposes, a skill he had refined over years of observing and manipulating the people around him. Most concerning was his complete lack of insight into the wrongness of his actions beyond the pragmatic understanding that society would punish him if caught. He didn't believe killing was morally wrong. He believed getting caught was strategically foolish. The distinction was everything. Dr. Chen's report concluded that Marcus represented an extreme danger to public safety, that his behavior was likely to escalate rather than diminish over time, and that traditional rehabilitative approaches would be ineffective because Marcus saw nothing in himself that needed to be fixed. The jailhouse phone calls Marcus made to his mother during those weeks of evaluation were recorded and later played in court, providing the most damning evidence of his true nature. Linda called her son every day, desperate to hear his voice, clinging to the belief that there had been some terrible mistake. In the first few calls, Marcus maintained his mask, telling her he loved her, saying he was scared, promising that everything would be okay. But as the days passed and the evidence mounted, and Marcus realized his mother was the only person left who might believe him, the mask began to slip. In one call, Linda asked him directly if he had hurt those people, her voice breaking on the question she had been too terrified to ask until that moment. Marcus was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something flat and clinical. He told her that the people who died were not important, that they had simply been available when he needed them to be. He said this casually, as if discussing homework rather than murder. Linda's gasp was audible on the recording, followed by a sound that might have been a sob or might have been her trying not to vomit. In another call, Marcus talked about the investigation as if it were a game he had almost won. He described the planning that went into each event, the satisfaction of executing his plans successfully, the frustration of the mistake with Emily that had finally led to his arrest. He spoke with pride, like an artist discussing their craft, seemingly oblivious to the fact that every word was being recorded and would be used against him. At one point he laughed, a genuine laugh, spontaneous and real in a way that his practiced emotions never were. He was laughing at something he remembered from one of the crime scenes, some detail that struck him as amusing in retrospect. The sound of that laugh, cold and devoid of humanity, was played in court and would haunt everyone who heard it. Linda stopped calling after that conversation. She couldn't make herself pick up the phone anymore, couldn't force herself to hear her son's voice, knowing what it meant. What he had become, or perhaps what he had always been beneath the surface, she had wanted so desperately to believe was real. The prosecution's case was built on layers of evidence that left no room for reasonable doubt. The DNA under Emily's nails was irrefutable. The fiber evidence connecting all three crime scenes pointed directly to a hoodie found in Marcus's closet, the same hoodie visible in security footage from multiple locations. Forensic timeline analysis placed Marcus in the vicinity of each murder during the estimated time of death. His own recorded statements, even couched in hypotheticals, demonstrated knowledge that only the perpetrator could possess. The defense argued diminished capacity due to age, suggesting that a 14-year-old brain was not fully developed and therefore not capable of truly understanding the consequences of such actions. They brought in their own psychologist who testified that adolescent impulsivity and poor judgment could explain Marcus's behavior, that with treatment and time, he might develop the empathy and insight he currently lacked. But the prosecution countered with Dr. Chen's evaluation, with the phone recordings, with the meticulous planning evident in each crime. This wasn't impulsivity. This wasn't a failure to understand consequences. This was calculated predatory behavior executed with chilling competence. Marcus sat through the proceedings with the same detached interest he brought to everything, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad as if he were studying for a test. He watched witnesses testify, listened to experts debate his psychology, observed his mother cry in the gallery. He showed curiosity about the process, but no distress about the outcome. During one recess, his attorney asked him if he understood the severity of the situation, that he was facing the possibility of life in prison. Marcus looked at her and asked a question that revealed everything about how he saw the world. He asked if prison was really that different from regular life, since both involved following rules and managing other people's expectations. His attorney had no answer for that. How do you explain to someone that freedom matters when they don't actually value anything beyond their own intellectual stimulation? How do you reach a person who sees other humans as objects rather than souls? The truth was, you couldn't. And everyone in that courtroom was beginning to understand that the boy sitting at the defense table wasn't someone who could be rehabilitated or reformed or taught to care. He was something fundamentally different, something that wore a human face but lacked the essential qualities that made someone truly human. And the question facing the judge wasn't whether Marcus understood what he had done. Clearly he did. The question was what justice looked like when the perpetrator was 14 years old and would never ever feel sorry for taking 3 innocent lives. Linda Chen had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the day police took her son into custody. She moved through her days like a ghost, going through the motions of existence without actually inhabiting her life. She called in sick to work so many times that eventually her supervisor gently suggested she take a formal leave of absence, no questions asked, no judgment given. Her co-workers had seen the news. They knew what her son was accused of, and while some expressed sympathy, others avoided eye contact in the hallways, unsure how to reconcile the tired nurse they had worked beside for years with the mother of someone who had done unspeakable things. Linda stopped going to the grocery store after a woman recognized her and made a scene, screaming accusations across the produce section while other shoppers pulled out their phones to record. She had food delivered instead, answering the door only long enough to grab the bags before retreating back into the house that suddenly felt like a museum of her own failures. Every photo on the wall, every drawing Marcus had made in elementary school, every report card and participation trophy, they all mocked her now, evidence of how completely she had misread her own child. The court proceedings became Linda's entire world, a ritualized torture she subjected herself to each day because abandoning Marcus felt like the final betrayal, even though staying felt like betraying the victims and their families. She sat in the gallery, usually alone, because the few friends who had initially offered support had gradually stopped calling, worn down by the relentless awfulness of the case, or quietly distancing themselves from association with her son's crimes. She watched lawyers argue about her son's brain development and psychological capacity. Listened to experts describe him using clinical terms that stripped away any remnant of the child she thought she had raised. She heard testimony about planning and premeditation, about the careful way Marcus had selected victims and executed his plans. Each piece of evidence was a hammer blow, shattering whatever fragile hope she had clung to that this was all somehow a mistake or a misunderstanding. The DNA evidence alone was irrefutable. Her son's genetic material had been found under a dead girl's fingernails where she had desperately tried to fight off her attacker. There was no explaining that away, no alternative narrative that made sense. But Linda didn't fully break until the day the prosecution played the jailhouse phone recordings. She had been warned they would be entered as evidence, had been told by a victim advocate that she might want to step out of the courtroom during that portion of the trial. But she stayed, some masochistic part of her needing to hear whatever was about to be revealed, needing to confront the full truth, no matter how much it destroyed her. The first few recordings were painful but bearable, Marcus maintaining his innocence, telling her he loved her, saying things that a scared kid might say. Linda recognized those calls. She had clung to them as proof that her son was still in there somewhere beneath the accusations and evidence. But then the prosecutor played a later call, one that Linda had ended so abruptly she hadn't fully processed what she was hearing at the time. Now, amplified through the courtroom speakers with dozens of people listening, there was no escaping it. Marcus's voice. I stripped of all pretense, explaining that the people who died were not important, that they had simply been available when he needed them. Linda's hands flew to her mouth as if she could physically stop the sound from reaching her. Around her, The gallery erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. The victims' families, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, reacted with visible rage and grief. One father stood up and had to be restrained by a bailiff. Emily Vasquez's mother let out a sound that was barely human, a wail of anguish that cut through every other noise in the room. And Linda sat frozen, listening to her son's voice describe human beings as objects, talk about murder as if it were an academic exercise, reduce 3 precious lives to obstacles in his own personal experiment. The detachment in his tone was complete. There was no hesitation, no shame, no awareness that what he was saying was monstrous. He spoke with the casual confidence of someone describing something perfectly ordinary, and that was somehow worse than any amount of anger or malice would have been. Malice implied emotion. This implied nothing at all except cold calculation. The recording continued, and Marcus's laugh echoed through the courtroom, that genuine, spontaneous laugh about something he found amusing from one of the crime scenes. The sound of it was obscene, a violation of the grief that saturated every inch of that room. Linda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. People turned to look at her, but she couldn't see them, so couldn't see anything except the door at the back of the courtroom that represented escape from the nightmare unfolding in surround sound. She stumbled into the aisle, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other reaching blindly for support. She made it halfway to the exit before her stomach rebelled, and she vomited into a trash can near the doors, her entire body heaving with the force of her revulsion. A bailiff appeared beside her, asking if she needed medical attention, but Linda shook her head and pushed through the doors into the hallway. She collapsed against the wall outside, sliding down until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. She couldn't breathe properly, couldn't get enough air into her lungs. And distantly, she recognized she was having a panic attack, but the knowledge didn't help her stop it. She sat there gasping and shaking while muffled voices continued on the other side of the doors, the trial proceeding without her, because the machinery of justice didn't stop for anyone's breakdown. The victim advocate who had tried to warn Linda about the recordings found her in the hallway 20 minutes later, still sitting against the wall with tears streaming down her face. The advocate sat down beside her, not saying anything at first, just being present in the wreckage. Eventually, Linda spoke, her voice raw and broken. She said she didn't recognize him anymore, that the voice in those recordings belonged to a stranger, that she had spent 14 years living with someone she had never actually known. The advocate listened without judgment, without offering empty platitudes about how everything would be okay, because nothing about this situation would ever be okay. Linda asked a question that had no good answer. She asked what she had done wrong, what she had missed, how she had failed to see that she was raising someone capable of this. The advocate gently explained that sometimes there were no early interventions that would have mattered, that certain psychological conditions weren't caused by parenting or environment, but by fundamental differences in brain structure and function. It wasn't Linda's fault that her son was what he was, but Linda shook her head, unable to accept that absolution. She was his mother. She should have known. She should have seen. Over the following days, Linda stopped attending the trial. She couldn't make herself walk back into that courtroom, couldn't force herself to sit there while more evidence was presented, and more experts dissected her son's psychology, and more recordings revealed the depths of his detachment. She watched some of the coverage on television from her living room, the sound muted, just images of lawyers arguing and witnesses testifying, and Marcus sitting calmly at the defense table as if none of this had anything to do with him. She stopped calling the detention center. The sound of Marcus's voice, even when he was performing concern or affection, now made her physically ill. She had spent years defending him, making excuses for behaviors that had sent up red flags she had chosen to ignore. The cruelty to animals she had dismissed as a phase. In the lies she had rationalized as normal childhood testing of boundaries. The complete lack of emotional response to other people's pain that she had convinced herself was just introversion or social awkwardness. Every warning sign had been there, and she had looked past all of them because acknowledging what they meant would have required confronting something too terrible to accept. The families of the victims struggled with how to feel about Linda. Some saw her as another victim, a woman who had lost her son to something incomprehensible. Others saw her as complicit, someone who should have stopped this before it started, who should have listened to the teachers and counselors who had tried to tell her something was wrong. The truth was probably somewhere in between, and in that complicated space where love and denial intersect with tragic consequences. Daniel Marsh's mother wrote Linda a letter that was never sent, but was later shared with a reporter. In it, she tried to articulate the impossible position of grieving a child while watching another mother grieve the loss of the son she thought she knew. She wrote about anger and forgiveness, about how both could exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. She wrote that she didn't blame Linda for what Marcus had done, but she also couldn't forgive her for not seeing it sooner. The letter ended without resolution, because there was no resolution to be found, just the terrible acknowledgement that multiple lives had been destroyed and nothing could ever put them back together. Linda stopped sleeping in her own bed, unable to lie there in the darkness, knowing that Marcus had slept down the hall for 14 years while she remained oblivious to what he was. She stayed on the couch instead, television on for company, dozing fitfully between news cycles that still covered the trial. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that had always been thin but was now bordering on gaunt. Friends who tried to check on her reported back that she seemed to be disappearing, fading into a shadow of herself. The few times she spoke about Marcus, she referred to him in the past tense, as if the boy she had raised was already gone and had been replaced by someone else wearing his face. In a way, that was exactly what had happened. The Marcus she thought she knew. The sweet, a quiet child who needed protection from a judgmental world had never actually existed. He had been a performance, a mask Marcus wore to move through life without attracting unwanted attention. The real Marcus, the one revealed in interrogation rooms and phone recordings, was someone Linda had never met despite living with him for 14 years. And now that she finally saw him clearly, she couldn't unsee him, couldn't go back to the comfortable ignorance that had allowed her to sleep at night. She whispered to the empty living room at 3 a.m, speaking to no one and everyone, asking a question that echoed through the entire case. She asked what you were supposed to do when you finally realized your child was a monster. How did you keep loving someone when love meant pretending they were something they weren't? Shu, could you mourn someone who was still alive but lost to you in every meaningful way? The television offered no answers, just more images of her son sitting in that courtroom, and Linda pulled a blanket over her head and tried to pretend the world wasn't real. The trial entered its third week with a media presence that had grown rather than diminished. Reporters camping outside the courthouse with cameras and microphones, hoping to catch a glimpse of the 14-year-old who had become the face of juvenile violence. Inside, the gallery was packed every day with a mix of victims' families, true crime enthusiasts, law students studying the precedent-setting nature of the case, and members of the public who couldn't reconcile the baby-faced defendant with the brutality he was accused of committing. Marcus had become a spectacle despite the court's efforts to maintain dignity and focus. Photographers weren't allowed in the courtroom, but sketch artists captured his image daily. The small frame dwarfed by the defense table, the neat haircut and pressed shirt that his attorney insisted he wear, the expression of mild interest that never quite matched the gravity of the proceedings. Those sketches would be shared across news outlets and social media, analyzed by armchair psychologists and commentators who debated whether evil could truly exist in someone so young, or whether society was simply witnessing the inevitable result of failed systems and broken families. Marcus seemed to enjoy the attention in his own detached way. He had always been someone who observed the world from a distance, studying people like specimens under glass, and now he was the specimen being studied by everyone else. The role reversal appeared to fascinate him. He took notes during testimony, his handwriting neat and methodical, sometimes underlining phrases or drawing asterisks next to points he found particularly interesting. His attorney had initially thought he was helping with his own defense, preparing questions or noting inconsistencies in witness statements. But when she looked at his notes during a recess, she found they were more like academic observations, commentary on courtroom procedures, sketches of the judge's expressions, random thoughts that had nothing to do with the serious business of defending himself against multiple murder charges. She quietly asked him to stop taking notes, worried that cameras might catch images of him appearing cavalier. But Marcus simply switched to observing without writing, his eyes tracking speakers with the focused intensity of someone watching a particularly compelling performance. The prosecution had built their case carefully, starting with forensic evidence and procedural testimony, before gradually introducing the more emotionally devastating elements. They called the medical examiner who walked the jury through autopsy findings, using clinical language that nonetheless painted vivid pictures of violence. They called forensic specialists who explained DNA analysis and fiber matching, turning complex science into clear narratives of connection. They called detectives who described the investigation, the slow recognition of a pattern, the moment when disparate cases suddenly resolved into a single perpetrator. Each witness added another layer to the mountain of evidence, and through it all, Marcus sat quietly, occasionally whispering brief comments to his attorney, but showing no visible distress. The jury watched him constantly, trying to read something in his face that might help them understand what they were dealing with. They saw a child who should have been worrying about algebra homework and school dances, sitting accused of taking 3 lives with calculated precision. The cognitive dissonance was intentional. The prosecution wanted the jury to sit with that discomfort, to resist the urge to let Marcus's age excuse the inexcusable. Then came the victim impact testimony, the portion of the trial where families were allowed to speak about what had been taken from them. Daniel Marsh's mother took the stand first, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. She described her son's dreams, his kindness, the hole his absence had left in their family that could never be filled. She spoke directly to the jury, making eye contact, making sure they understood that Daniel had been a real person with a future that had been stolen. When she finished, she turned to look at Marcus, waiting for some reaction, some sign of recognition or remorse. Marcus looked back with polite attention, his face neutral, his eyes revealing nothing. She walked past the defense table on her way back to her seat, and as she did, something happened that would dominate news coverage for days afterward. Marcus's mouth moved, forming words that the microphones didn't catch, but several witnesses later claimed to have seen. Lip readers brought in by television networks analyzed the footage and agreed on what he had said. He had mouthed, "Interesting," as Daniel's mother walked past him, commenting on her testimony as if it were a performance he was critiquing rather than the grief of a woman whose son he had killed. The courtroom erupted. Daniel's father lunged toward the defense table before bailiffs intercepted him. The judge's gavel came down repeatedly, sharp cracks demanding order. Spectators shouted, some at Marcus, some at the bailiffs, some just releasing rage that had been building throughout the trial. Marcus's attorney looked horrified, turning to her client with urgent whispers that he ignored, his attention focused on the chaos he had triggered. For just a moment, his careful mask slipped, and something else showed through. Satisfaction. Maybe even pleasure at being the center of such intense reaction. He had caused this. His single word, not even spoken aloud, had ignited the room. The power of that realization flickered across his face before he caught himself and rearranged his expression into something appropriately chastened. But people had seen it. The jury had seen it. And in that instant, whatever remaining doubt anyone might have harbored about Marcus's capacity for remorse evaporated completely. The judge called a recess, clearing the courtroom to let tensions cool. When proceedings resumed an hour later, she addressed Marcus directly, her tone sharp with barely controlled anger. She warned him that any further disruptions, any disrespect shown to the victims or their families, would result in his removal from the courtroom and the trial continuing without his presence. Marcus nodded his understanding, but the damage was already done. His single word had revealed more than hours of expert testimony ever could. It showed the jury exactly what prosecutors had been arguing all along, that Marcus viewed these proceedings as entertainment, that he felt no connection to the suffering around him, that he was fundamentally incapable of recognizing other people as deserving the same consideration he expected for himself. The defense attempted damage control, suggesting that Marcus was overwhelmed and responding inappropriately due to stress and his young age. But the explanation fell flat. What the courtroom had witnessed wasn't an overwhelmed child acting out. It was calculated provocation. Marcus testing boundaries and enjoying the results. Tyrell Johnson's sister took the stand next, her victim impact statement delivered with shaking hands and fierce determination. She described a brother who had worked 2 jobs to help support their family, who had dreamed of making music that would inspire people, who had been reduced to a case number and a body in a morgue because someone decided his life didn't matter. She looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, refusing to let him look away, forcing him to at least visually acknowledge her, even if he couldn't emotionally comprehend her pain. When she finished, she did something unexpected. She walked over to the defense table and stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that a bailiff moved forward in case intervention was needed. She didn't threaten or yell. She simply asked him a question, her voice quiet enough that the microphones barely caught it. She asked if he remembered her brother's face, if he remembered Tyrell as a person or just as something he had done. Marcus looked up at her, and for several long seconds the courtroom held its breath waiting for his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was equally quiet, but clear enough to be heard. He said yes, he remembered. But the way he said it, the clinical detachment in those 3 words, made it clear that remembering didn't mean the same thing to Marcus as it did to everyone else. Tyrell's sister stared at him for a moment longer, tears streaming down her face, and then she walked away, shaking her head. She told reporters later that looking into Marcus's eyes was like looking into emptiness, that there was nothing there to appeal to, no conscience to awaken, no humanity to reach. She said it was the most frightening moment of her life, worse even than identifying her brother's body, because it forced her to accept that some people simply didn't have the capacity to care about anyone but themselves. Emily Vasquez's mother was the last to testify, and her statement was brief because she could barely speak through her grief. Emily had been her youngest child, her only daughter, the light of their family. She had been 16 years old with her whole life ahead of her, and now she was gone because a boy 2 years younger had decided to take what didn't belong to him. Emily's mother didn't look at Marcus. She couldn't make herself do it. She spoke to the jury instead, begging them to see her daughter as more than evidence in a case, to remember that Emily had loved animals and soccer and her friends, that she had been someone's sister and daughter, and the loss of her would echo through their family for generations. When she stepped down, she had to be supported by victim advocates on both sides, her legs giving out under the weight of having to exist in the same room as her daughter's killer. The prosecution rested their case shortly after, the evidence and testimony creating an overwhelming narrative of guilt and monstrousness. The defense would present their arguments next, their impossible task of somehow creating reasonable doubt where none existed, or convincing the jury that Marcus deserved mercy, despite showing none himself. But the day ended with one more moment that would be replayed endlessly on news broadcasts and social media. As the court adjourned and Marcus was being led back to the holding cell, he turned to look back in the gallery one last time. His eyes found his mother's empty seat, the space she had occupied earlier in the trial before the recordings drove her away. Something crossed his face. Not sadness exactly, but perhaps the closest approximation of it that Marcus was capable of feeling. Then his eyes swept across the rest of the gallery, past the families who had lost everything, past the reporters scribbling notes, past the strangers who had come to witness justice. And he smiled, not broadly, not theatrically, just a small upward turn of his lips that might have been mistaken for nervousness if you didn't know better. But everyone in that courtroom knew better now. They had seen behind the mask. They understood that Marcus Chen was smiling because he was exactly where he wanted to be, at the center of attention, being studied and discussed and analyzed, finally recognized as different in the way he had always known he was. He disappeared through the door with bailiffs on either side, and the courtroom slowly emptied, people walking out into the late afternoon sun, feeling like they needed to wash off the contamination of having been in his presence. Evil was supposed to be obvious and monstrous and easy to identify. But evil, it turned out, could look like a 14-year-old boy in a button-down shirt, and that realization made everyone who witnessed it feel fundamentally less safe in a world they thought they understood. The defense had an impossible task, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. There was no credible way to dispute the evidence, no alternative theory that explained away the DNA under Emily's fingernails or the fiber matches connecting Marcus to all three crime scenes, or his own recorded statements describing details only the perpetrator could know. So instead, they focused their strategy on the only argument that held any weight: Marcus's age. They brought in developmental psychologists who testified about adolescent brain development, explaining that the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and judgment wasn't fully formed until the mid-20s. They argued that a 14-year-old, no matter how intelligent or calculating he appeared, simply didn't have the neurological capacity to truly understand the permanence and consequences of his actions. They presented research showing that juvenile offenders had higher rates of rehabilitation success than adults, that with proper treatment and intervention, even seriously troubled youth could develop the empathy and moral reasoning they currently lacked. It was a clinical academic defense that asked the jury to see Marcus not as a monster, but as a child whose brain hadn't caught up with his intelligence, someone who deserved a chance at redemption because his mind was still developing. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating in its simplicity. They didn't dispute the science about brain development. Instead, they focused on the specific evidence of Marcus's behavior, on demonstrating that this wasn't a case of impulsive violence or poor judgment in a heated moment. They displayed a timeline on screens at the front of the courtroom, 3 separate incidents spanning 14 months, each one carefully planned and executed. They showed security footage of Marcus at various locations in the days before each murder, scouting routes, observing patterns, positioning himself to intercept victims at their most vulnerable. This wasn't impulse. This was premeditation refined through practice. The prosecutor walked the jury through each piece of evidence methodically, building a narrative that was impossible to deny. She showed photographs of the hoodie found in Marcus's closet, the fabric worn and faded, with fiber samples that matched materials collected from all 3 victims. She explained how rare it was to find such perfect consistency across multiple crime scenes, how the odds of coincidence were statistically impossible. The DNA evidence was presented next, and a geneticist explained the analysis in terms the jury could understand. The cells found under Emily Vasquez's fingernails contained genetic markers that matched Marcus Chen with a probability of accuracy that exceeded 1 in several billion. There was no other person on Earth who could have left that biological evidence. The defense suggested possible contamination or mislabeling of samples. But the forensic team's documentation was meticulous, chain of custody unbroken, procedures followed with textbook precision. Multiple independent labs had verified the results. The science was sound, and the science said that Marcus had been in physical contact with Emily during her final moments, that she had fought hard enough to take a piece of him with her, and that piece had become the irrefutable proof of his guilt. The prosecutor held up photos of Emily's hands, the defensive wounds visible even in the clinical forensic images, and asked the jury to remember that this 16-year-old girl had fought for her life while Marcus overpowered and killed her. Brain development didn't excuse that. Youth didn't erase that. Nothing could justify that. The surveillance footage montage came next, compiled from dozens of cameras across the city. The prosecution had spent weeks assembling this presentation, and it played on the courtroom screens like a horror film where the monster hid in plain sight. There was Marcus on September 28th, captured at a convenience store 3 blocks from Riverside Park at 8:45 in the evening, the same night Daniel Marsh was killed. The timestamp was clear in the corner of the frame. He was wearing a dark hoodie, hands in pockets, buying water and candy. He looked completely ordinary, just another teenager on an evening errand. The footage jumped to February 14th, a camera at a gas station across from the shopping center where Tyrell Johnson worked. There was Marcus again, same hoodie, visible even in the poor quality video, standing near the air pump at 9:15, 45 minutes before Tyrell's estimated time of death. He appeared to be waiting for something, checking his phone, watching the parking lot. The video jumped again to April 26th, or a residential security camera 2 blocks from where Emily Vasquez was found. Marcus on his bike, riding slowly past houses, the hoodie tied around his waist because the evening was warm. He circled the block twice, visible on 2 different neighbors' cameras before the footage ended. The pattern was undeniable. Marcus had been in the vicinity of each crime at the time each crime occurred. The defense argued that proximity didn't equal participation, that being near a location wasn't the same as committing murder. But when combined with everything else, the DNA, the fibers, the recorded statements, the psychological profile, the surveillance footage became one more piece in a puzzle that formed a complete and horrifying picture. The prosecutor displayed all 3 videos side by side, showing Marcus at different locations on different dates, but always with the same purposeful presence, always alone, always during the narrow windows when young people lost their lives. She asked the jury to consider the statistical improbability of someone being near 3 separate murder scenes by pure coincidence. She asked them to use their common sense, to trust the evidence in front of them rather than grasping for alternative explanations that required ignoring reality. The footage played on a loop while she spoke. Marcus's image multiplied across 3 screens, a silent testimony to his presence at the scene of each tragedy. Then came the digital evidence, text messages, and internet searches recovered from Marcus's phone and laptop. The forensic tech specialist explained how even deleted data could be recovered from devices, how nothing was truly erased once it entered the digital world. Marcus's search history from the months leading up to the first murder included terms that made the jury visibly uncomfortable: how to avoid leaving DNA evidence, average police response times, autopsy procedures, criminal profiling methods. The defense argued these were the searches of a curious teenager interested in true crime content, no different from the millions of people who watched crime documentaries or listened to murder podcasts. But the prosecutor pointed out the timing, how the searches intensified in the weeks before Daniel Marsh's death, how they evolved from general curiosity to specific tactical questions. After the first murder, the search history showed Marcus looking up news coverage of his own crime, reading articles about the investigation, and apparently monitoring how close police were getting to identifying him. Most damning were the text messages to himself, notes Marcus had made in a messaging app, thinking they were private. Short phrases that read like reminders or observations. Park too crowded weeknights. Service alley cameras face parking lot, not dumpsters. People don't look up when walking. These weren't the idle thoughts of someone interested in crime as entertainment. These were operational notes, lessons learned, adjustments for future attempts. The prosecutor displayed them on screen one at a time, letting each statement sink in. Marcus had been learning from experience, refining his approach, treating each incident as a stepping stone toward greater competency. The final text note was dated 3 days before Emily's murder. Just 2 words that carried enormous weight. One more. It suggested planning, anticipation, intention. Marcus had been thinking about victim number 4 when he was caught, when Emily's fingernails captured the DNA that would finally connect the dots investigators had been struggling to see. That 2-word text message hung on the screen for a long moment while the courtroom absorbed its implications. One more. How many more after that? How many lives might have been taken if Marcus hadn't made the single mistake that brought his carefully constructed facade crashing down? The prosecution saved the most powerful evidence for last. Marcus's own words. They played selected portions of the jailhouse phone calls again, not the entire recordings that had driven his mother from the courtroom, but specific segments that demonstrated his mindset. Marcus describing victims as available rather than valued. Marcus discussing the crimes with intellectual detachment as if analyzing someone else's work. Marcus laughing at a memory from a crime scene. Between each audio clip, the prosecutor paused to let the jury sit with what they had heard, to process the absence of remorse or humanity in Marcus's tone. She didn't need to editorialize or interpret. The recordings spoke for themselves, offering a window directly into Marcus's mind that no expert testimony could match. This was Marcus unfiltered, speaking to the one person he thought might still believe him, revealing the truth he carefully hid from everyone else. The recordings proved that his courtroom demeanor, the quiet attention, the occasional note-taking, on a mask of appropriate behavior, was exactly that, a mask. The real Marcus was the voice on those recordings, cold and curious and utterly disconnected from the suffering he had caused. The defense made one final attempt to introduce doubt, calling a child psychiatrist who testified that adolescent antisocial behavior could sometimes be temporary, that personality disorders diagnosed in youth didn't always persist into adulthood. She suggested that with intensive therapy and medication and structured environment, Marcus might develop the capacity for empathy that he currently lacked. It was a hopeful testimony, asking the jury to imagine a future Marcus who felt remorse and understood the gravity of what he had done. But on cross-examination, the prosecution asked the psychiatrist a simple question. Had she personally evaluated Marcus Chen? She admitted she had not. She was speaking theoretically about possibilities for juvenile offenders in general, not specifically about this defendant. The prosecutor then asked her to review Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation of Marcus, the one completed after weeks of direct observation and testing. The psychiatrist read through it silently, her expression growing more troubled as she progressed through the findings. When asked for her professional opinion based on that specific evaluation, she admitted that Marcus's profile was among the most severe she had encountered, that the prognosis for developing genuine empathy was poor, that the risk of future violence remained extremely high, regardless of intervention. The defense rested their case shortly after, having done everything they could with the limited arguments available to them. They had presented the science of brain development, the possibility of rehabilitation, the argument for mercy based on youth and incomplete psychological formation. But they couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence that sat between their client and acquittal. They couldn't explain away the DNA or the fibers or the surveillance footage or Marcus's own recorded words. They couldn't produce a single witness who could testify to his good character or capacity for empathy, because no such witness existed. Even his own mother couldn't bring herself to take the stand in his defense, couldn't make herself tell the jury that her son deserved another chance when she had finally heard the truth of what he was. The evidence had spoken with a voice louder and clearer than any argument, and that voice said that Marcus Chen, despite his age, despite his intelligence, despite every mitigating factor the defense could produce, had killed 3 people deliberately and methodically, and would likely kill again if given the opportunity. The jury had seen everything they needed to see. Now they just needed to decide what justice looked like when the perpetrator was someone who should have been worried about homework instead of homicide, someone who wore the face of a child but possessed the soul of something far darker. The jury deliberated for 7 hours across 2 days, a relatively short time considering the complexity of the case and the weight of the decision they faced. Court watchers and legal analysts had predicted a quick verdict given the overwhelming evidence, but the jury took their responsibility seriously, reviewing testimony and exhibits with methodical thoroughness. They requested to see the surveillance footage again, to review the DNA analysis reports, to rehear portions of Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation. Inside the deliberation room, 12 ordinary citizens grappled with an extraordinary question: whether a 14-year-old could be held fully accountable for acts that would condemn an adult to life in prison. Some jurors initially struggled with Marcus's age, unable to reconcile the baby-faced defendant with the calculated violence he had committed. But as they reviewed the evidence piece by piece, as they listened again to his recorded voice describing victims as objects, as they studied the timeline showing months of escalating violence, the moral clarity became unavoidable. Age didn't erase premeditation. Youth didn't justify taking 3 innocent lives. Marcus Chen had known exactly what he was doing, and he had done it anyway. The courthouse received word that a verdict had been reached on a Thursday afternoon, and within minutes the information spread through news networks and social media. Reporters who had been covering other assignments rushed back to the courthouse. Victims' families who had been waiting in nearby hotels hurried to claim their seats in the gallery. Spectators who had been following the trial lined up outside, hoping to witness the moment when justice was finally pronounced. Linda Chen received a call from the victim advocate assigned to her case, informing her that the jury had made their decision and asking if she planned to be present when it was read. Linda sat on her couch holding the phone, the television muted on news coverage of the impending verdict, and tried to imagine walking back into that courtroom. She tried to picture sitting there while strangers decided her son's fate, while cameras captured her reaction, while the families of his victims watched to see if she would cry or maintain the hollow composure that was all she had left. She told the advocate she couldn't do it, that she had already lost her son in every way that mattered, and hearing the verdict wouldn't change that reality. She hung up the phone and turned off the television, choosing to wait in silence rather than watch the moment unfold in real time. The courtroom filled quickly, every seat claimed. Bailiffs turning away, disappointed spectators once capacity was reached. The atmosphere was electric with tension, that particular quality of anticipation that precedes moments that will be remembered and discussed for years. Daniel Marsh's parents sat together holding hands, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but also with the grim determination of people who had endured something unsurvivable and kept going anyway. Terrell Johnson's mother and sister sat with their arms linked, drawing strength from physical connection. Emily Vasquez's family occupied an entire row, parents and siblings and grandparents who had come to witness justice for their girl who should have been worrying about prom dresses instead of existing only as a memory and a crime scene photo. They had all lived in limbo since the trial began, suspended between grief and the hope that something definitive would emerge from these proceedings. Some acknowledgement that their loved ones mattered and the person who took them would face consequences. Now that moment had arrived, and the weight of it pressed against everyone in the room. Marcus was led in by bailiffs, wearing the same button-down shirt and khakis that had become his courtroom uniform. He scanned the gallery with his usual mild curiosity, noting faces and gaps, perhaps noticing that his mother's seat remained empty. If he felt any anxiety about what was coming, it didn't show in his expression or posture. He sat at the defense table beside his attorney, who looked exhausted and defeated in a way that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with representing someone who made her skin crawl every time they spoke. She had done her job to the best of her considerable ability, mounting every defense available, protecting her client's rights through a process that many would say he didn't deserve. but she would later tell colleagues that she had never been more relieved to reach the end of a case, that representing Marcus Chen had been the most disturbing experience of her career because of the complete absence of anything recognizable as conscience or remorse. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder in a gesture that was more procedural than comforting, and Marcus glanced at her with polite acknowledgment, but nothing deeper. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose as one, the collective movement creating a sound like wind through trees. Everyone settled back into their seats, and the judge addressed the room in the stern tone she reserved for maintaining order during emotional moments. She reminded those present that regardless of the verdict, she expected dignified behavior and would remove anyone who disrupted proceedings. The warning was aimed primarily at the victims' families, an acknowledgment that whatever was about to happen would trigger powerful reactions that needed to be contained within acceptable boundaries. She then instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury, and 12 men and women filed into the jury box with the solemn bearing of people who had just made one of the hardest decisions of their lives. They didn't look at Marcus as they took their seats, a detail that experienced court watchers noted as a significant tell. Juries that had voted to acquit often looked at defendants with sympathy or reassurance. These jurors kept their eyes forward or down, avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested they had just condemned someone and didn't want to see his face when the words were spoken aloud. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict, and the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as an accountant and had approached her jury duty with systematic rigor, stood and confirmed that they had. The court clerk accepted the verdict forms and handed them to the judge, who reviewed them silently before passing them back to be read aloud. The clerk's voice was steady and professional as she addressed the first count. So in the matter of the state versus Marcus Chen, count 1, murder in the first degree of Daniel Marsh, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The word landed like a physical blow. In the gallery, Daniel's mother let out a sound that was half sob and half exhale of relief. The clerk continued without pause. Count 2, murder in the first degree of Tyrell Johnson. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Tyrell's sister closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been thanks. The clerk read the third count. Murder in the first degree of Emily Vasquez. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Emily's mother collapsed forward, her body racked with sobs that shook her entire frame, held upright only by the family members on either side of her. 3 times guilty. 3 times condemned. The verdict was complete. Marcus sat motionless during the reading, his expression unchanged, his hands folded calmly on the table. If he felt fear or shock, or anything at all, it remained hidden beneath the mask he wore so effectively. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, leaning close to whisper something that he appeared to ignore. Around them, the courtroom erupted in controlled chaos, people crying and embracing, reporters frantically typing on phones and laptops, sketch artists capturing the moment with rapid strokes. The judge's gavel came down repeatedly, demanding order, reminding everyone that proceedings were not complete. She thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of what they had been asked to do, and excused them from any further obligation to the case. The jurors filed out quickly, several of them visibly emotional, relieved to be released from the burden of sitting in judgment. Later interviews would reveal that the deliberations had been painful but ultimately unanimous, that even those who initially struggled with convicting someone so young had been convinced by the evidence that no other verdict was possible. They had voted to convict because the law and the facts demanded it, because 3 people were dead and the person responsible needed to be held accountable regardless of his age. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports to be compiled and for both sides to prepare their arguments about what punishment fit crimes that defied easy categorization. Marcus was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs, his hands now cuffed in front of him, the presumption of innocence officially gone. He turned back once before disappearing through the door, his eyes scanning the gallery one final time. He looked confused, not distraught or regretful, but genuinely puzzled, as if the verdict were a math problem he couldn't solve. For the first time in his life, Marcus had encountered a situation where his intelligence and manipulation couldn't control the outcome. The system had looked at all the evidence, heard all the arguments, and decided that he was guilty. He had been caught, exposed, condemned, and the look on his face suggested he still couldn't quite understand how it had happened, how the world had refused to see him as special and exceptional and deserving of different rules. He disappeared from view, and the gallery slowly emptied, our people streaming into the hallway where reporters waited with cameras and questions. The victims' families held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, reading prepared statements through tears and trembling voices. They thanked the jury for seeing the truth, thanked the prosecutors for fighting for justice, thanked everyone who had supported them through the unimaginable grief of losing someone to violence. They spoke about their loved ones not as victims, but as people. Daniel with his dreams of graphic design, Tyrell with his music, Emily with her kindness and volunteer work. They reclaimed their stories from the narrative of violence, insisting that these 3 lives would be remembered for who they were rather than how they died. But they also acknowledged that the verdict, while necessary and deserved, it didn't bring closure, because closure wasn't possible when someone you loved had been stolen from you. The guilty verdicts meant that Marcus Chen would face consequences, but they didn't bring back the people he had taken. Justice had been served, but the price of that justice was 3 funerals and 3 families permanently broken. They walked away from the microphones holding each other up, disappearing into waiting cars, heading back to homes that would always feel emptier than they should. Miles away, Linda Chen sat in her darkened living room and stared at the wall where photos of Marcus still hung, remnants of a life that had turned out to be built on illusions. She knew without checking her phone or turning on the television that the verdict had come back guilty. She had known it would, and had known from the moment she heard those jailhouse recordings that there was no universe where her son walked free from this. The question now wasn't guilt, but punishment, and that would be decided in 3 weeks at a sentencing hearing she couldn't imagine attending but also couldn't imagine missing. She was Marcus's mother, and that identity carried obligations that didn't disappear just because the person she thought she had raised turned out to never have existed at all. She sat in the silence and the darkness and tried to remember what hope felt like, but the memory was too distant to grasp. All she had left was the obligation to bear witness, to stand in the ruins of everything she thought she knew and wait for the final chapter of a story that had become a nightmare no one would ever wake up from. And the 3 weeks between verdict and sentencing passed in a strange suspended reality where the outcome was certain, but the specific consequences remained undefined. Legal experts filled cable news segments debating the range of possible sentences, analyzing precedents for juvenile offenders convicted of multiple murders, discussing the tension between rehabilitation and public safety. Some argued that Marcus's age mandated a focus on treatment and eventual reintegration, that even the most damaged adolescent brain retained capacity for change. Others insisted that certain acts placed perpetrators beyond redemption regardless of age, that 3 calculated murders demonstrated such profound danger that only permanent incarceration could protect society. The debate raged in academic journals and social media threads, that in opinion columns and podcast episodes, everyone with an angle or expertise weighing in on what justice should look like in this case. But ultimately, the decision belonged to one person, Judge Patricia Reeves, a 23-year veteran of the bench, known for thoughtful rulings and an unwavering commitment to following both the letter and spirit of the law. Judge Reeves spent those 3 weeks reviewing everything. She read the trial transcripts cover to cover, revisiting testimony and evidence with the careful attention of someone preparing to make a decision that would define careers and set precedents. She studied the pre-sentencing reports prepared by probation officers and psychologists, thick documents that attempted to paint a complete picture of Marcus Chen, his background, his psychological profile, on his prospects for rehabilitation, his risk to public safety. She reviewed juvenile sentencing laws in her state and others, examining how different jurisdictions balanced punishment with the recognition that children, even dangerous children, were fundamentally different from adults in ways that should influence how they were treated by the justice system. She read victim impact statements that the families had submitted, heartbreaking documents that articulated loss in ways that transcended legal arguments and spoke to the human cost of Marcus's actions. And she wrestled privately with the weight of knowing that whatever sentence she imposed would be scrutinized and criticized, that some would call her too harsh while others would insist she was too lenient, or that there was no satisfying everyone when the case involved a 14-year-old convicted of serial murder. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived with a cold rain that matched the somber mood of everyone gathering at the courthouse. Security was heightened following threats that had been made against Marcus through social media and anonymous phone calls, people who believed the only appropriate sentence was one that couldn't legally be imposed on a juvenile. Metal detectors processed a steady stream of bodies. Family members and reporters and concerned citizens and activists on both sides of the juvenile justice debate. The courtroom filled to capacity again, the same faces occupying the same seats they had claimed throughout the trial, everyone returning for the final act of this tragedy. At the victims' families sat together on one side of the gallery, a united front of grief demanding accountability. On the other side, scattered among strangers and observers, sat a handful of people who knew Marcus from school or the neighborhood, present more out of morbid curiosity than support. And in the back row, wearing sunglasses despite the dim indoor lighting and a scarf pulled up to partially obscure her face, Linda Chen took a seat and tried to make herself invisible. Marcus was brought in wearing the same courtroom clothes that had become familiar over weeks of trial. But something about him looked different. The casual confidence that had characterized his earlier appearances had been replaced by something harder to read. Not fear exactly, but perhaps the first hints of understanding that this situation was beyond his ability to manipulate or control. He scanned the courtroom, and his eyes found his mother in the back row. Their gazes locked for just a moment, and something passed between them that no one else could interpret. Recognition, maybe, or goodbye, or the acknowledgement that whatever relationship they once had existed only as a memory now. Linda looked away first, unable to hold eye contact with someone who wore her son's face, but had turned out to be a stranger. Marcus turned back to face the judge's bench, his shoulders straightening, his mask sliding back into place as he prepared to hear his fate pronounced. Judge Reeves entered, and the courtroom rose, settling back into seats with the rustle of fabric and the creak of wood. The judge arranged papers on her bench with deliberate care, taking a moment to compose herself before beginning. She acknowledged the presence of the victims' families, expressing condolences that felt inadequate against the magnitude of their loss, but necessary nonetheless. She acknowledged the difficulty of the case, the questions it raised about justice and youth, and the capacity for change. Then she addressed Marcus directly, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that commanded attention. She told him that she had reviewed every piece of evidence, read every expert opinion, considered every argument presented by both prosecution and defense. She told him that she had struggled with this decision in ways that few cases in her career had demanded, or that she had lost sleep weighing the principles of juvenile justice against the reality of 3 lives taken with calculated precision. And then she told him something that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Judge Reeves said that the law recognized adolescents as different from adults, that brain development science supported treating juvenile offenders with an emphasis on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. She said these principles were important and worthy and designed to protect children from being condemned for mistakes made during a period of incomplete psychological development. But she continued, her voice hardening. Those principles were built on assumptions that didn't apply to every case. They assumed impulsivity rather than planning. They assumed the capacity for remorse even if not yet realized. They assumed that with time and treatment and guidance, young offenders could develop the moral reasoning and empathy that they currently lacked. Everything she had seen in this case, every piece of evidence and expert testimony, and Marcus's own recorded words, suggested that those assumptions didn't hold true for him. This wasn't a teenager who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of rage or peer pressure or poor judgment. This was someone who had repeatedly and deliberately taken human lives, who had planned and learned and refined his methods, who had shown not just an absence of remorse, but an inability to even comprehend why remorse might be appropriate. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Reeves continued, laying out her reasoning with methodical precision. She cited the psychological evaluation that had concluded Marcus represented an extreme danger to public safety. She referenced the jailhouse recordings where he had described victims as objects rather than people. She discussed the escalating pattern: 3 murders in 14 months with gaps that grew shorter, suggesting increasing compulsion rather than decreasing risk. She acknowledged the defense arguments about brain development, but noted that multiple experts had testified Marcus's capacity for planning and manipulation was already fully formed, even if his capacity for empathy was not. She talked about the victims, speaking their names slowly and clearly: Daniel Marsh, Terrell Johnson, Emily Vasquez. 3 people who had futures and dreams and families who loved them. All of that erased because Marcus Chen decided their lives mattered less than his curiosity about what it felt like to kill. Judge Reeves paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom. And then she delivered the core of her ruling. She said that the purpose of sentencing was multifaceted: punishment, deterrence, protection of society, and, when possible, rehabilitation. In this case, she had concluded that rehabilitation was not a realistic goal based on Marcus's psychological profile and complete absence of remorse. Deterrence was largely irrelevant because people like Marcus didn't respond to the threat of consequences the way typical offenders did. That left punishment and protection of society as the primary considerations, and both pointed toward the same conclusion. Marcus Chen had committed acts that demanded the maximum penalty available under juvenile law, with the understanding that he would be reevaluated when he reached adulthood to determine if continued incarceration remained necessary. Judge Reeves's voice was firm and clear as she pronounced sentence. For each count of murder in the first degree, Marcus Chen would be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentences would run consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning Marcus would need to serve a minimum of 75 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. Given his current age of 14, that meant he would be 89 years old before he could even apply for release. And an age that represented effectively a life sentence, even with the technical possibility of parole built in to satisfy legal requirements around juvenile sentencing. The words hung in the air for a moment before their full meaning registered. 75 years minimum. Life effectively ending before it had truly begun. Marcus's attorney closed her eyes, having expected severity, but perhaps not quite this much. Marcus himself sat perfectly still, his face blank as he processed what he had just heard. Around the courtroom, reactions varied wildly. The victims' families wept with relief and grief intermingled, the vindication of a harsh sentence, doing nothing to fill the holes in their hearts, but at least providing certainty that Marcus would never hurt anyone else. Advocates for juvenile justice reform shook their heads, seeing the sentence as an abandonment of rehabilitation principles and a return to purely punitive approaches. Legal analysts frantically typed on their phones, knowing this case would be cited in debates about juvenile sentencing for decades to come. And in the back row, Linda Chen put her face in her hands and sobbed for the son she had lost twice, once to the realization of what he was, and now to a sentence that meant she would likely never see him outside of a prison visiting room for the rest of her natural life. Judge Reeves wasn't finished. She addressed Marcus again, telling him that she hoped the experts were wrong, that she hoped somewhere inside him existed the capacity to develop empathy and remorse and understanding of what he had done. She told him that the possibility of parole, however distant, was real, and that if he ever wanted to walk free again, he would need to spend the next decades demonstrating genuine change rather than performing it. She told him that 3 families would never get their loved ones back, that he had created wounds that would never fully heal, and that carrying that knowledge should weigh on him even if it didn't seem to now. She told him that he would have years and years to think about his choices, to read and learn, and perhaps grow into someone capable of understanding the magnitude of his actions. And she told him, her voice softening just slightly, that despite everything, she hoped he would use that time to become someone different than the person sitting in her courtroom today. It was the closest thing to compassion anyone had shown Marcus throughout the proceedings. A small acknowledgement that he was still technically a child, even if his actions belonged to someone much darker. Then the moment passed, and Judge Reeves's voice returned to its professional firmness as she concluded the sentencing and ordered Marcus remanded to custody to begin serving his sentence immediately. Bailiffs stepped forward to escort Marcus out of the courtroom for the last time. He stood slowly, his movements mechanical, his face still showing that puzzled expression as if he couldn't quite compute how he had ended up here. As he was turned toward the door, he looked back at the gallery one final time. The smirk that had characterized so many of his courtroom appearances was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of fear, or might have been confusion that the world had refused to bend to his will. His eyes found his mother in the back row, and for just a second his mask cracked enough to show something almost human underneath. Maybe regret, maybe loss, maybe just the realization that he was completely alone. Then bailiffs guided him through the door, and he was gone, disappearing into a system that would contain him for the rest of his functional life. The door closed with a heavy finality, and the first chapter of Marcus Chen's story ended while the victims' families began the impossible work of learning to live with a justice that could never truly be enough. The courtroom remained still in the moments after Marcus disappeared through the heavy door. People processing what they had just witnessed, trying to reconcile the severity of the sentence with the image of a 14-year-old being led away in handcuffs. Judge Reeves had not left the bench yet, an unusual choice that suggested she had more to say. That the formal pronouncement of sentence wasn't the end of her statement to this courtroom and to anyone who would read the transcripts or watch the news coverage afterward. She looked out at the assembled faces, at the families who had lost everything, at the reporters documenting every word, at the scattered observers who had come seeking answers to questions about justice and youth and the nature of evil. Then she did something unprecedented in her years on the bench. She delivered an additional statement, speaking not as a judge constrained by legal formalities, but as a human being trying to articulate something important about what this case meant and why the sentence she had just imposed, harsh as it was, represented the only viable response to what Marcus Chen had done. Judge Reeves began by addressing the elephant that had loomed over every aspect of this case from the beginning: Marcus's age. She acknowledged that 14 years old was painfully young, that in a just world, someone that age should be concerned with school and friendships and discovering who they wanted to become. She acknowledged the science showing adolescent brains were still developing, that impulse control and judgment and empathy continued maturing well into the 20s. She acknowledged that juvenile justice philosophy was built on the principle that children were different from adults in ways that mattered, that they deserved opportunities for redemption that adult offenders might not. She said she believed in those principles deeply, that she had spent her career trying to balance accountability with the recognition that young people could change and grow and become better than their worst moments. But, she continued, her voice taking on an edge of steel, those principles had limits. They couldn't be stretched to cover every situation regardless of circumstances. They couldn't be used as shields to protect society from confronting hard truths about certain individuals who, despite their chronological youth, demonstrated such profound danger that standard approaches simply didn't apply. She spoke about the concept of criminal sophistication, explaining that the law traditionally considered both age and behavior when determining culpability. A child who committed violence during a spontaneous fight, who showed immediate remorse, who had a realistic prospect of rehabilitation, that child deserved the full protections and opportunities that juvenile justice offered. But Marcus Chen, she stated firmly, did not fit that profile in any meaningful way. His crimes weren't spontaneous. They were planned, executed, and repeated over more than a year. He didn't show remorse. He showed curiosity about his own notoriety and frustration at being caught. His psychological evaluation didn't suggest typical adolescent impulsivity. It revealed a level of manipulation and predatory calculation that would be disturbing in an adult and was absolutely chilling in someone so young. Judge Reeves said that at some point behavior became so egregious and risk so extreme that age alone couldn't justify treating someone as if they simply hadn't learned right from wrong yet. Marcus knew right from wrong. He understood it intellectually, even if he couldn't feel it emotionally. He just didn't care, and that distinction changed everything. Judge Reeves then addressed something that had generated significant debate during trial, whether Marcus should be tried as an adult or as a juvenile. The prosecution had argued for adult court, believing the severity of the crimes warranted adult consequences. The defense had successfully argued for juvenile jurisdiction, correctly noting that state law presumed juvenile court for defendants under 16 unless extraordinary circumstances justified transfer. Judge Reeves had ultimately agreed with keeping the case in juvenile court, but not because she believed Marcus deserved lenient treatment. She kept it in juvenile court because juvenile law, properly applied, and actually allowed for responses that adult court couldn't provide, specifically the ability to impose lengthy sentences with built-in reevaluation periods that acknowledged the possibility, however remote, that people could change over time. Adult court would have required either a fixed sentence with mandatory release after a set term or true life without parole, which was constitutionally problematic for juvenile offenders. Juvenile court allowed her to impose what was effectively a life sentence while technically preserving the possibility of eventual release, should Marcus somehow demonstrate genuine transformation decades from now. It was, she explained, actually the harshest legally defensible option available to her. Then Judge Reeves said something that would be quoted in every news report and legal analysis of the case. She looked toward the door where Marcus had exited and spoke as if he could still hear her, as if her words could somehow penetrate the psychological barriers that separated him from normal human emotion. She said, "Marcus Chen, you came into this courtroom as a 14-year-old, and the law required me to consider your youth as a mitigating factor in sentencing. I have done that. I have reviewed every argument about brain development and rehabilitation potential. But I want to be absolutely clear about something. When you planned the death of Daniel Marsh, when you carried out that plan and watched him die, you were not a child in any meaningful sense. When you did the same to Tyrell Johnson and then to Emily Vasquez, refining your methods and learning from experience, you were not acting with childish impulsivity or poor judgment. You were acting with calculated intent that would horrify most adults. So while the law sees a 14-year-old, and while you may look young sitting in this courtroom, the truth is that you stopped being a child the moment you decided other people's lives were yours to take. You are not a child today. You are something else, and this sentence reflects that reality." The words landed with devastating clarity, cutting through every defense argument about youth and potential and second chances. Judge Reeves wasn't denying that Marcus was chronologically 14. She was stating that his actions had placed him outside the category of children who deserve the protections designed for typical juvenile offenders. She continued, addressing the courtroom more broadly now, speaking to the families and the public and future judges who might cite this case as precedent. She talked about the tension between mercy and justice, about how societies struggle to respond when someone very young committed acts of extreme violence. She said there were no good answers, only least bad options, and that in this case, the least bad option was ensuring Marcus Chen could never again have the opportunity to harm another person. She acknowledged that some would criticize her sentence as too harsh, that advocates for juvenile justice reform would point to this case as an example of the system failing to live up to its rehabilitative ideals. She acknowledged that others would criticize the sentence as too lenient, that victims' rights advocates would argue that someone who took 3 lives deserved harsher punishment regardless of age. Judge Reeves said she had made peace with the certainty that not everyone would agree with her decision, because unanimous approval was impossible in a case this complex and emotionally charged. What mattered, she said, was that the sentence was just according to the law and proportionate to the crimes committed. 3 lives taken with premeditation and increasing sophistication earned 75 years minimum before parole eligibility. That wasn't vengeance. That wasn't giving up on rehabilitation. That was acknowledging that certain acts carried consequences severe enough that society's primary obligation became protection rather than redemption. She noted that Marcus would have access to educational programs and psychological treatment throughout his incarceration, that he would have opportunities to work on himself if he chose to do so, that the distant possibility of parole meant he theoretically retained some stake in personal growth. But she was honest about her expectations. The psychological evaluation suggested Marcus's capacity for genuine change was minimal at best. He might learn to mimic remorse more effectively. He might become skilled at telling parole boards what they wanted to hear. But true transformation required a foundation of empathy that experts believed Marcus simply didn't possess. The sentence reflected that grim reality while leaving a door barely open, just in case every expert was wrong. The judge then did something that brought audible sobs from the victims' families. She spoke directly to them, naming each victim and acknowledging them as full human beings rather than case numbers. She talked about Daniel Marsh's dreams of becoming a graphic designer, about the art portfolio his mother had shared in her victim impact statement, about potential cut short by someone else's cruelty. She talked about Terrell Johnson's music, about the beats he had been creating in his home studio, about a voice that would never be heard because Marcus Chen decided it didn't matter. She talked about Emily Vasquez's kindness, about her volunteer work at the animal shelter, about the joy she brought to everyone who knew her, about the future she should have had filled with soccer games and college applications and everything a 16-year-old girl deserved to experience. Judge Reeves said these names slowly and clearly, making sure they echoed through the courtroom, ensuring they became part of the permanent record of this case. She said that while the legal proceedings focused necessarily on Marcus and his culpability, the case was really about Daniel and Terrell and Emily, about lives that mattered and families that would never be whole again. She spoke directly to the families then, her voice softening with genuine compassion. She told them that no sentence could restore what they had lost, that justice in cases like this was always incomplete and unsatisfying, because the only true justice would be having their loved ones back, which was impossible. And she told them that she hoped the sentence provided some measure of peace, some certainty that the person responsible would face consequences proportionate to his actions, and that society had taken their loss seriously. She acknowledged that they would live with this pain for the rest of their lives, that holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments would always carry the weight of absence, that healing was too simple a word for the complicated process of learning to exist around a wound that would never fully close. She thanked them for their strength in attending the trial, for their dignity in the face of unimaginable grief, for their willingness to speak their loved ones' names and share their stories, so that Daniel and Terrell and Emily would be remembered as people rather than just victims. What she told them, they had honored their loved ones through their presence and their testimony. And she hoped they could find some way forward, not past their grief, but alongside it, carrying their loved ones' memories into whatever future they could build from the wreckage. Then Judge Reeves shifted her attention one final time, looking toward the back of the courtroom where Linda Chen sat with her face still buried in her hands. The judge's voice remained compassionate but firm as she acknowledged the impossible position of Marcus's mother, someone who had lost a son while also having to confront the horrifying reality of who that son actually was. Judge Reeves said that Linda bore no legal responsibility for Marcus's actions, that parents couldn't be held accountable for the choices their children made once those children reached an age of independent action and decision-making. But she also acknowledged that Linda would spend the rest of her life wrestling with questions that had no satisfactory answers, wondering if there had been warning signs she missed, or interventions she should have pursued, or some way she could have prevented this tragedy. Judge Reeves gently suggested that those questions, while natural, were ultimately unanswerable and potentially destructive. Some people, she said, were simply wired differently from birth, their brains processing empathy and consequence in ways that no amount of good parenting could fix. Linda had raised her son the best way she knew how, and what he became wasn't a reflection of her failure, but of something fundamental in his nature that existed beyond her control or influence. The courtroom was silent except for quiet crying as Judge Reeves concluded her remarks. She had spoken for nearly 20 minutes beyond the formal sentencing, using her position to articulate something larger than legal precedent, trying to make sense of a case that resisted easy explanations. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave the bench, but paused for one final statement. She said that this case would stay with her, that she would think about Marcus Chen and wonder if she had made the right decision, if there had been some other path that might have balanced justice and mercy more perfectly. But she also said she believed, based on everything she had seen and heard, that protecting society from Marcus was paramount, and that the sentence she had imposed accomplished that goal while remaining within the boundaries of law and constitutional requirements. She hoped that years from now, when people looked back on this case, they would understand that she had tried to honor both the victims who deserved justice and the principles of juvenile law that deserved respect, even when applying those principles to someone who tested their limits in the most extreme way possible. Then she brought down her gavel one final time, the sharp crack signaling the end of proceedings, and left the bench to a courtroom that remained seated in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed and what it meant for everyone touched by this tragedy. The courthouse steps became a stage for raw emotion in the minutes after sentencing concluded. The victims' families emerged first, surrounded by victim advocates and prosecutors who had fought for justice on their behalf. News cameras immediately swarmed, reporters shouting questions that were both invasive and inevitable, given the public interest in the case. Daniel Marsh's father stood at the podium that had been hastily set up, his wife beside him with her hand clutched in his, and addressed the assembled media with a voice that shook despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. He said that 75 years felt both like too much and too little. Too much because a part of him still recoiled at the idea of condemning anyone so young to effective life imprisonment. Too little because no amount of time could balance against the permanent loss of his son. He said the sentence brought a measure of relief, a certainty that Marcus Chen would never have the opportunity to hurt another family the way he had hurt theirs. But he also said, his voice breaking, that relief didn't feel the way he thought it would. His son was still gone. Justice had been served, but Daniel wasn't coming home. Nothing about this felt like winning. Tyrell Johnson's mother spoke next, her daughter standing beside her for support, both of them wearing T-shirts with Tyrell's face printed across the front above the words, "Forever loved, never forgotten. She talked about the impossibility of moving forward, about how people kept telling her that time would make it easier, but time just seemed to make the absence more permanent, more real. She said she was grateful for the judge's words, for the recognition that Tyrell had been a person with dreams and talent and people who loved him, not just a statistic in a case about juvenile sentencing. She said she hoped Marcus would spend every day of his incarceration thinking about what he had taken, though she doubted he possessed the capacity to truly understand. She said she would never forgive him, that forgiveness was something she didn't have to offer, and didn't want to pretend to feel just to make other people comfortable. Her anger was valid, and her grief was permanent, and the sentence meant she could at least stop worrying that Marcus might someday walk past her on the street or show up in her neighborhood or have any kind of normal life while her son remained in the ground. Emily Vasquez's parents stood together at the podium, her father with his arm around her mother's shoulders, both of them exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness into something existential. Emily's mother spoke in Spanish, her native language, with a translator repeating her words in English for the cameras. She said that her daughter had been pure light, that she had brought joy to everyone she encountered, that the world was genuinely worse without her in it. She said that Marcus Chen had stolen not just Emily's life, but all the lives Emily would have touched, all the good she would have done, all the love she would have shared. She said the ripple effects of his actions would extend far beyond the 3 immediate victims, affecting children who would never be born, people who would never be helped, moments of beauty and connection that would simply never exist because Emily wasn't there to create them. She said the sentence felt like a small acknowledgement of that enormous loss, a recognition that what Marcus had done was so terrible that he needed to be removed from society for the rest of his functional life. Then she said something that made every reporter stop typing and simply listen. She said she prayed for Marcus sometimes, not because she forgave him, but because she couldn't stand the thought of anyone being as empty and hollow as he appeared to be. She prayed that he would somehow, someday, develop the capacity to understand what he had done, because living with that understanding would be a worse punishment than any prison could provide. The families left the courthouse together, a united group bound by the most terrible kind of shared experience, and the cameras turned their attention to legal analysts and advocates who had gathered to provide commentary on the sentence and its implications. Juvenile justice reform advocates expressed disappointment that the judge had imposed such a lengthy sentence, arguing that it represented an abandonment of rehabilitation principles and a return to purely punitive approaches that research suggested were ineffective and unjust. They pointed out that brain science clearly showed adolescents were different from adults, that the capacity for change remained real even in seriously troubled youth, that Marcus deserved opportunities for treatment and growth rather than warehousing in prison for 75 years. They worried about the precedent being set, about whether this case would be used to justify harsh sentences for other juvenile offenders who might actually be capable of redemption if given appropriate support. They acknowledged the tragedy of the victims while insisting that adding another lost life, even Marcus's, even lived behind bars, didn't actually restore anything or make anyone safer in the long term. Victims' rights advocates took the opposite position, arguing that the sentence was appropriate and perhaps even lenient given the circumstances. They pointed to the calculated nature of Marcus's crimes, the complete absence of remorse, the psychological evaluation indicating minimal prospects for change. They argued that public safety had to be the paramount concern, that protecting potential future victims mattered more than preserving theoretical rehabilitation opportunities for someone who had already proven himself to be an extreme danger. They noted that the sentence technically still allowed for parole after 75 years, maintaining the legal fiction that Marcus might someday be released, even though realistically he would likely die in prison. They said this was exactly how the system should work, acknowledging the science about juvenile brains while also recognizing that certain individuals fell outside the normal distribution, that some crimes were so terrible they demanded responses that prioritized protection over redemption. They praised Judge Reeves for her courage in imposing a sentence that would inevitably generate criticism from both sides, arguing that being criticized from multiple directions usually meant you had found the right middle ground. Inside the courthouse, prosecutors gathered their files and prepared to move on to the next cases, demanding their attention. The normal rhythm of the criminal justice system already reasserting itself, even as this particular case concluded. The lead prosecutor spoke briefly to reporters, saying she was satisfied with the outcome and believed justice had been served as fully as possible, given the legal constraints around juvenile sentencing. She acknowledged that no sentence could truly be adequate for 3 murders, but she felt the judge had struck the right balance between recognizing Marcus's age and protecting society from someone who had demonstrated such profound danger. She noted that the case had been unusually challenging because of the tension between what Marcus was chronologically and what he was behaviorally, between the child-faced defendant sitting in court and the calculating predator revealed in the evidence. She said she hoped the victims' families could find some measure of peace now that the legal process had concluded, though she knew from experience that closure was a word people used more than an actual state anyone achieved after losing someone to violence. The defense attorney declined to speak to media, slipping out a side entrance to avoid the cameras that would inevitably ask her how it felt to defend someone like Marcus Chen. But she had spoken candidly with colleagues inside the courthouse, on expressing relief that the case was over and admitting that representing Marcus had been the most disturbing experience of her career. She had defended murderers before, including other juveniles who had committed serious violence. But something about Marcus was different. Most clients showed some flicker of humanity, even if they couldn't express it well. Fear, shame, love for family. Something that marked them as people who had done terrible things, rather than people who simply were terrible. Marcus had shown none of that. He had been cooperative and intelligent and utterly empty of anything resembling normal human emotion. She had done her job to the best of her ability because everyone deserved competent representation, but she had no illusions about her client or what he was. She told a colleague that she hoped the psychological evaluations were wrong, that Marcus might somehow develop empathy over the decades ahead, but she suspected he would simply become better at faking it while remaining fundamentally unchanged beneath the performance. Linda Chen never left the courthouse through the front entrance. She waited until the media presence thinned, then exited through a back door with her face covered and her body hunched against the cold rain that had continued throughout the day. A victim advocate had offered to arrange transportation, understanding that Linda was as much a casualty of this case as anyone, even if her pain came from a different source than the victims' families. Linda declined, saying she needed to be alone, needed to process what had just happened without anyone watching or trying to help. She walked several blocks through the rain before calling a car service, standing under an awning outside a closed shop, trying to comprehend the fact that her 14-year-old son had just been sentenced to 75 years minimum in prison. She had carried him in her body, had nursed him through childhood illnesses, had celebrated his birthdays and worried about his future, and loved him with the fierce totality that mothers bring to their children. And he had turned out to be someone who killed people, who felt nothing about it, who was now lost to her in every way that mattered. The car arrived and she climbed in, giving her address to a driver who didn't recognize her. And she rode through streets she had driven thousands of times, feeling like she was moving through a foreign country where nothing made sense anymore. Marcus Chen began his life sentence in a secure juvenile facility designed for the most serious young offenders, a place where violence and danger were managed through strict routines and constant supervision. He was placed in a single cell for his own protection after staff received intelligence that other inmates might target him, given the nature of his crimes. Prisoners had their own hierarchies and codes, and people who killed children or committed certain types of violence were often considered fair game, even by others serving lengthy sentences. Marcus adjusted to incarceration with the same detached observation he brought to everything else. He followed rules because non-compliance carried consequences, not because he internalized any moral obligation to do so. He attended mandated psychological counseling sessions where therapists tried various interventions to develop empathy and remorse, achieving only limited progress that mostly amounted to Marcus learning what responses earned positive evaluations. He participated in educational programs because they broke up the monotony of prison routine, and because he enjoyed learning even if he couldn't connect it to anything beyond intellectual stimulation. He read voraciously, everything from classic literature to psychology texts to true crime books, studying the world through pages since he could no longer experience it directly. Years would pass with Marcus aging through adolescence and into adulthood behind bars, his teenage years spent in secure juvenile facilities before eventual transfer to adult prison. He would be periodically evaluated to assess his progress and determine whether he posed a continued threat to public safety. The evaluations would consistently conclude that while Marcus had developed sophisticated understanding of social expectations and could articulate appropriate responses to hypothetical moral dilemmas, his fundamental psychological structure remained unchanged. He understood intellectually that other people valued their lives and experienced pain, but that understanding never translated into genuine empathy or remorse. He learned to mimic emotion more effectively over time, studying other inmates and staff and television programs to refine his performance. But those who knew him well could still detect the emptiness beneath. He would eventually become something of a case study in criminal psychology programs. She a teaching example of severe antisocial personality disorder in a juvenile offender. Researchers would request permission to interview him, seeking to understand how someone so young became something so dangerous, and Marcus would cooperate because attention gratified him in ways that normal human connection did not. His name would appear in textbooks and academic papers, his case cited in debates about juvenile justice and neuroscience and the nature versus nurture question that his existence seemed to answer in the most troubling possible way. The world outside continued turning while Marcus remained locked away. The victims' families learned to carry their grief rather than resolve it, finding ways to function around holes that never filled. Daniel's parents started a scholarship fund in his name for students interested in graphic design. Tyrell's family compiled his music and released it online, where it found a modest but appreciative audience. Emily's parents began volunteering at the animal shelter where she had worked, finding some comfort in continuing the service she had valued. These activities didn't heal anything or bring anyone back, but they provided ways to honor memory and create meaning from tragedy. The families would never be the same people they were before their loved ones were killed, but they learned to be different people, carrying their losses and their love into whatever future they could construct. And miles away in a secure facility, Marcus Chen sat in a cell and read books, and participated in programs, and waited for the decades to pass. Isolated from the consequences he had created, but inescapably connected to them through the sentence that would define the rest of his life. The case of Marcus Chen didn't end with his sentencing. Instead, it marked the beginning of a much larger conversation that would reshape juvenile justice policy for years to come. Within weeks of Judge Reeves's decision, the case was being cited in legislative hearings and academic conferences, referenced in law review articles and policy briefs, analyzed from every angle by people trying to understand what it meant for how society treated its youngest offenders. The legal community was deeply divided. Some scholars argued that the Chen case demonstrated the need for flexibility in juvenile sentencing, for recognition that not all youth offenders fit neatly into rehabilitative frameworks, that extreme cases sometimes demanded responses that prioritized public safety over second chances. Others insisted the case represented everything wrong with a system that abandoned its principles when faced with difficult circumstances, that giving up on a 14-year-old, regardless of what he had done, meant abandoning the core premise that children were fundamentally different from adults in ways that should influence how justice was administered. Both sides found ammunition in the same facts, interpreting the evidence through philosophical frameworks that led to completely opposite conclusions about what the appropriate response should have been. State legislators took notice of the case, particularly the tension it revealed between public expectations for accountability and legal limitations on juvenile sentencing. Several states began reviewing their laws around trying juveniles as adults, some moving to make it easier to transfer serious offenders to adult court, while others moved in the opposite direction, strengthening protections that kept youth in juvenile systems even when charged with severe crimes. The Chen case became a touchstone in these debates, invoked by representatives on both sides depending on which aspect of the case they chose to emphasize. Those advocating for harsher juvenile sentences pointed to Marcus's calculated violence and complete lack of remorse, arguing that the system needed mechanisms to respond appropriately to youth who posed extreme danger regardless of age. Those advocating for stronger rehabilitation focus pointed to Marcus's age and brain development, are arguing that even the most troubling cases deserve treatment-focused responses rather than purely punitive ones. The case became less about Marcus Chen the individual and more about what society believed about children and crime and redemption, a proxy debate for larger philosophical questions that had no easy answers. The psychological community engaged in its own reckoning, with Marcus's case forcing uncomfortable conversations about whether certain personality structures could truly be changed through intervention, or whether some individuals were simply beyond the reach of therapeutic approaches. The diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder in juveniles was controversial to begin with many clinicians reluctant to apply labels that carried implications of permanence to young people whose brains were still developing. But Marcus's psychological profile was so extreme, his lack of empathy so profound, that it challenged optimistic assumptions about the malleability of youth. Conferences dedicated panels to discussing his case, with experts debating whether his outcome could have been different with earlier intervention, or whether his fundamental psychological architecture was set from birth in ways that no amount of therapy could alter. Some researchers proposed new screening tools to identify potentially dangerous youth before they acted on violent impulses, while others worried about the ethical implications of labeling children as future threats based on psychological characteristics that might or might not predict behavior. The debate was passionate and unresolved, revealing how much remained unknown about why some people developed normally and others became predators despite similar environmental circumstances. Victim advocacy groups embraced the Chen case as vindication of their position that justice systems had overcorrected toward leniency for young offenders. That in the rush to recognize adolescent brain differences, society had lost sight of the very real harm that some juveniles caused. They organized around the names of Daniel Marsh, Tyrell Johnson, and Emily Vasquez, using their stories to push for legislative changes that would ensure future violent offenders received serious consequences, regardless of age. They successfully lobbied for laws mandating lengthy minimum sentences for juveniles convicted of multiple murders, arguing that Marcus's 75-year minimum should become standard rather than exceptional. They created victims' rights organizations that provided support to families navigating the criminal justice system while simultaneously advocating for policy changes that emphasized accountability over rehabilitation. Their efforts were effective in shifting public opinion, with polls showing increased support for tough responses to serious juvenile crime, even as academic research continued to emphasize the importance of age-appropriate interventions. The disconnect between expert opinion and public sentiment created ongoing tension in how juvenile justice policy developed in the years following Marcus's sentencing. Meanwhile, juvenile justice reform advocates watched the Chen case's influence with growing alarm, seeing it weaponized against broader efforts to keep youth out of adult prisons and to invest in rehabilitation rather than incarceration. They argued that Marcus Chen was an extreme outlier, that using his case to justify harsh sentences for all serious juvenile offenders ignored the reality that most young people who committed crimes were fundamentally different from him, that most possessed the capacity for growth and change that Marcus apparently lacked. They pointed to research showing that the vast majority of juvenile offenders aged out of criminal behavior, that brain maturation naturally improved impulse control and judgment, that investing in treatment and education for youth had better long-term outcomes than lengthy incarceration. They worried that the public's understandable horror at Marcus's crimes would generate policy that harmed thousands of other young people who deserved second chances. That one extreme case would be used to justify abandoning rehabilitation principles that generally worked when properly applied. They fought legislative battles, state by state, trying to preserve protections for juvenile offenders, even as the Chen case gave their opponents powerful ammunition in the court of public opinion. The case also reached the appellate courts as Marcus's attorneys filed appeals challenging various aspects of his trial and sentencing. They argued that 75 years minimum before parole eligibility constituted cruel and unusual punishment for a 14-year-old, that it violated constitutional protections against excessive sentences for juveniles that the Supreme Court had established in previous cases. They argued that the trial court had failed to give adequate weight to Marcus's age and developmental status, that the judge had essentially treated him as an adult, despite keeping the case in juvenile court. They cited neuroscience research about adolescent brain development, arguing that sentencing someone to effective life imprisonment before their brain was fully formed violated evolving standards of decency. The appeals worked their way through the system slowly, with lower courts consistently upholding the sentence and finding that Judge Reeves had appropriately balanced all relevant factors. The appellate judges noted that the sentence, while severe, included the possibility of parole and therefore didn't violate constitutional prohibitions against life without parole for juveniles. They emphasized that Marcus's case was extraordinary in its facts, that multiple murders committed with premeditation and escalation justified a response at the outer limit of what juvenile law allowed. The appeals ultimately failed, but they kept Marcus's case in the public eye and ensured ongoing debate about whether the sentence represented justice or represented a justice system giving up on one of its most fundamental principles. Judge Reeves herself became an unexpected figure in juvenile justice debates, invited to speak at conferences and symposiums about her decision in the Chen case. She approached these invitations carefully, declining most but accepting a few where she felt she could contribute to nuanced discussion rather than simply being used as a symbol by one side or the other. In her speeches, she emphasized that Marcus's case was exceptional, that she had spent her entire career believing in rehabilitation for young offenders and hadn't abandoned that belief just because she had encountered one individual who seemed beyond its reach. She talked about the difficulty of the decision, the sleepless nights reviewing evidence and wrestling with competing principles, the weight of knowing that her sentence would be scrutinized and cited for decades. She urged policymakers not to use Marcus Chen as a template for responding to all serious juvenile crime, but also not to ignore the reality that some youth posed extreme danger that couldn't be adequately addressed through standard rehabilitative approaches. She argued for systems that maintained flexibility, that allowed judges to consider individual circumstances rather than applying one-size-fits-all solutions regardless of context. Her measured approach won respect from people across the ideological spectrum. Even those who disagreed with her ultimate decision, recognizing that she had grappled seriously with competing values rather than simply imposing her personal views. The media continued covering Marcus Chen periodically, updating the public on his incarceration status and filing anniversary stories on the dates of the murders and the sentencing. Documentaries were produced examining the case from multiple angles, interviewing family members and legal experts and psychologists, trying to understand how a 14-year-old became a serial killer and what it meant for society's understanding of juvenile crime. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing the case, debating whether the sentence was just, speculating about Marcus's psychological makeup and whether he might someday develop remorse. The coverage kept the victims' names alive, ensuring that Daniel and Tyrell and Emily weren't forgotten even as years passed and other cases captured public attention. But it also meant that Marcus remained a subject of fascination, his name recognizable, his case studied and dissected and debated in ways that granted him a kind of infamy that some worried might gratify his narcissism even from behind bars. The question of whether giving attention to violent offenders encouraged others seeking notoriety remained unresolved, another aspect of the case that generated more questions than answers. 5 years after Marcus's sentencing, the state legislature passed a law that became known informally as the Chen Law, establishing enhanced sentencing guidelines for juveniles convicted of multiple homicides. The law mandated minimum sentences of 50 years before parole eligibility for youth convicted of 2 or more murders, with judges retaining discretion to impose longer terms based on specific circumstances. Supporters argued the law provided clear guidance and ensured consistency, that it prevented situations where dangerous offenders received inappropriately lenient sentences simply because of their age. Critics argued it tied judicial hands and failed to account for individual differences, that it treated all juvenile multiple murder cases the same when the circumstances and offenders might be dramatically different. The law passed with bipartisan support, proof that Marcus's case had shifted political calculations around juvenile justice in ways that persisted years after his sentencing. The victims' families attended the signing ceremony, standing beside the governor as he added his signature to legislation named in memory of their loved ones. A bittersweet moment that acknowledged their loss while doing nothing to restore what had been taken. And in a prison cell, Marcus Chen continued his daily routine, unaware that his case had generated a law that would affect countless other young people in years to come. his legacy extending far beyond the 3 lives he had taken into the structure of the justice system itself. 10 years passed before Linda Chen finally stopped visiting the prison where her son was incarcerated. She had gone every month during the first years, sitting across from Marcus in a visiting room, surrounded by other families, trying to maintain connections through layers of security and supervision. The visits were painful and surreal, looking at someone who shared her features and her history, but remained fundamentally unreachable behind barriers that had nothing to do with the plexiglass separating them. Marcus performed the role of dutiful son during these visits, asking about her health and her work, sharing sanitized details about prison educational programs and daily routines. But Linda could see through the performance now, could recognize the calculated quality of his interest and the emptiness beneath his pleasant expressions. She kept visiting not because it brought her comfort, but because walking away felt like a final abandonment, the ultimate admission that her son was truly lost. Eventually, though, the weight of pretending became too much. After a decade of monthly pilgrimages to a place that smelled like industrial cleaner and despair, she simply stopped going. She sent a letter explaining that she needed to focus on her own healing, that the visits weren't helping either of them, that she would always love the child she thought she had raised, even while accepting that child had never actually existed. Marcus responded with a brief note acknowledging her decision, his tone polite and devoid of emotional depth, proving once again that her presence or absence made no meaningful difference to him. The victims' families marked each anniversary of their losses with private rituals and public memorials that ensured their loved ones remained more than statistics in a famous case. Daniel Marsh's parents established a successful scholarship program that had sent 15 students through graphic design programs at local colleges, each recipient learning about the young man whose death had funded their education. They attended graduation ceremonies and met with scholarship recipients, finding purpose in creating opportunities from tragedy. Tyrell Johnson's music lived on through streaming platforms where his beats had found an audience that appreciated his talent without knowing the full story of how his life ended. His family curated his digital legacy carefully, celebrating his artistry while also speaking publicly about the reality of losing someone to violence. Emily Vasquez's name graced a memorial garden at her high school, a quiet place where students could sit and reflect, where her parents sometimes came to feel close to her, in the place where she had laughed with friends and worried about tests and experienced the ordinary teenage life that ended too soon. These tangible remembrances mattered because they insisted that the victims were people first, defined by how they lived rather than how they died, and their value measured in love and memory rather than in connection to the person who killed them. Marcus aged through his 20s in prison, his body maturing into adulthood, while his psychological structure remained largely unchanged despite years of mandated therapy and intervention. Evaluations continued to document his high intelligence, his sophisticated understanding of social expectations, and his persistent inability to feel genuine empathy or remorse. He learned to provide textbook-correct answers to moral questions, could articulate why killing was wrong in ways that sounded rehearsed because they were, could describe appropriate emotional responses to hypothetical situations involving harm to others. But when evaluators dug deeper, when they presented scenarios designed to reveal authentic emotional processing rather than memorized scripts, Marcus's fundamental detachment became apparent. He understood consequences intellectually, but didn't internalize them emotionally. He knew society valued human life, but didn't personally share that value beyond recognizing he needed to pretend to do so if he ever wanted to be released. The evaluation reports accumulated in his file, a paper trail documenting a person who had learned to fake humanity more skillfully over time without actually developing any. The juvenile justice landscape continued evolving in directions influenced by Marcus's case, but also by countless other cases and changing political winds and new research about adolescent development. By some states moved toward harsher penalties for serious juvenile offenders, embracing mandatory minimums and easier paths to adult court. Others doubled down on rehabilitation, investing in therapeutic programs and alternatives to incarceration, even for youth who had committed serious violence. The results were mixed and hotly debated, with both approaches showing successes and failures that advocates on each side interpreted as vindication of their position. What became increasingly clear was that juvenile offenders weren't a monolithic group, that treating all young people the same ignored important differences in psychological development, criminal sophistication, and capacity for change. The challenge was creating systems flexible enough to respond appropriately to vast individual variation while also maintaining consistency and fairness. Marcus Chen remained a difficult case to fit into any framework, an outlier so extreme that using him to justify broader policy often distorted more than it clarified. But his case persistently appeared in debates anyway, proof that extreme examples captured public and political attention in ways that typical cases never could. 25 years after his sentencing, Marcus came up for his first parole eligibility review, a procedural requirement, even though no one seriously expected him to be released. He was 39 years old by then, half his life spent in custody, his remaining hair beginning to gray at the temples. The parole board reviewed his institutional record, which showed no disciplinary infractions and consistent participation in programs. They reviewed psychological evaluations, which continued to document sophisticated manipulation skills and fundamental lack of empathy. They heard testimony from the prosecutors who had convicted him, now senior attorneys in their offices, but still vividly remembering the case that had defined significant portions of their careers. They heard from victims' family members, some of the original survivors, joined by children who had grown up hearing stories about siblings, or parents taken by Marcus Chen, a second generation carrying the grief forward. The testimony was heartbreaking and fierce, insisting that Marcus remain exactly where he was for the rest of his natural life. That someone who had taken 3 lives with such calculated cruelty deserved no mercy and no second chances. Marcus addressed the board personally, delivering remarks that his attorney had helped him prepare, but that he had refined through decades of studying how to sound remorseful without actually feeling it. He spoke about understanding the pain he had caused, about using his years in prison to reflect on his actions and develop the empathy he had lacked as a teenager. He acknowledged that no apology could restore what he had taken, but he offered one anyway, his words carefully chosen and his delivery practiced enough to sound almost genuine. He talked about the educational degrees he had earned behind bars, about counseling certifications and anger management courses, and every program the institution offered. He presented himself as someone transformed by time and intervention, someone who had matured from the disturbed child who had committed terrible acts into an adult capable of understanding their magnitude and weight. It was a compelling performance, and if the parole board had been evaluating his presentation skills, or his intelligence, or his ability to mimic appropriate emotion, they would have rated him highly. But they were evaluating whether he posed a danger to public safety if released. And on that question, the evidence remained clear. The board denied parole unanimously, noting in their written decision that Marcus had failed to demonstrate genuine remorse or authentic psychological change, that his presentation appeared rehearsed and calculated rather than reflective of true transformation. They scheduled his next review for 10 years later, when he would be 49, and the cycle would repeat. The news of Marcus's parole denial brought relief to the victims' families and to a public that had followed his case for decades. Social media erupted with opinions and reactions, most people agreeing that someone who had killed 3 people as a teenager deserved to remain imprisoned regardless of how much time had passed or how well behaved he had been behind bars. A few voices argued that 25 years was long enough, that Marcus had been essentially a child when he committed his crimes, that at some point punishment needed to give way to recognition that people could change. But those voices were drowned out by the majority, who insisted that certain acts placed people beyond redemption, that Marcus had demonstrated through his crimes and his persistent lack of genuine remorse that he would always pose a danger if released. The debate was predictable and largely rehearsed variations of arguments that had been made for 25 years. But it kept the case alive in public consciousness, ensuring new generations learned about Marcus Chen and what he represented in broader conversations about justice and youth and the possibility of change. Judge Patricia Reeves, retired by this point but still occasionally commenting on high-profile cases, released a brief statement after Marcus's parole was denied. She said she had followed his case over the decades and remained convinced that her original sentence had been appropriate. She noted that the parole board's decision vindicated her assessment that Marcus's capacity for genuine change was minimal, that his years of good behavior in prison reflected his intelligence and calculation rather than authentic transformation. She expressed hope that he might eventually develop real remorse and empathy, but she acknowledged that hope was likely unrealistic given everything psychological science understood about his particular profile. She concluded by noting that the justice system had worked as intended, giving Marcus the opportunity to demonstrate change while protecting society until such change was convincingly shown. The fact that he had failed to show authentic transformation after 25 years suggested he never would. And the parole board had appropriately prioritized public safety over theoretical rehabilitation that showed no signs of materializing. Marcus returned to his cell after the parole hearing, his routine unchanged, his days stretching ahead in the same predictable pattern they had followed for decades. He had books to read and programs to attend and hours to fill with activities that gave structure to a life lived entirely within institutional walls. He would come up for parole again in 10 years, and then 10 years after that, and then again and again until he either died in prison or convinced a parole board that he had genuinely changed into someone safe to release. The odds of the latter seemed vanishingly small, given his consistent pattern of performance without substance, his ability to say right things without meaning them in any authentic way. He existed in a kind of limbo, alive but sequestered from the world, aging through years that blurred together in institutional sameness. It was a half-life, neither executed nor freed, maintained at public expense in a system designed more to contain than to rehabilitate people who fell outside the normal distribution of human psychology. The courtroom where Marcus had been sentenced was repainted and refurnished over the years, nothing remaining of the physical space that had witnessed his trial, except the architecture itself. But the memory of what happened there persisted, carried forward by legal scholars and victims' rights advocates and judges who cited the Chen case when grappling with difficult sentencing decisions involving young offenders. The empty chair where Marcus once sat became a metaphor invoked in countless discussions about justice and youth, and the terrible reality that some people, regardless of age, posed dangers that society's usual responses couldn't adequately address. The gavel that had struck the bench pronouncing his sentence rested in Judge Reeves's private collection, a reminder of the hardest decision she had made in her career. And in courtrooms across the country, judges continued wrestling with cases that didn't fit neatly into frameworks designed for typical offenders, trying to balance competing principles of mercy and protection, rehabilitation and accountability, hope and realism. The law had spoken with Marcus Chen, delivering a verdict and a sentence that declared his actions unacceptable regardless of his age, that insisted 3 lives taken deserved consequences severe enough to protect future potential victims. It wasn't perfect justice because perfect justice didn't exist in a world where violence couldn't be undone and lost lives couldn't be restored. But it was the best justice that law and society could provide, an acknowledgement that what happened mattered, that the victims weren't disposable, that the person responsible would be held accountable in ways proportionate to his actions. Marcus had thought he was clever enough to evade consequences, that his youth would shield him, that his intelligence would protect him. He had been wrong. The smirk he wore in those early courtroom appearances had long since disappeared, replaced by the practiced expressions of someone who had learned that performing remorse was necessary even if feeling it remained impossible. Authority had closed his story, not with execution or simple imprisonment, but with a sentence that acknowledged both his youth and his danger, that held space for theoretical change while recognizing its improbability. And in that closing, in that final pronouncement of 75 years minimum before parole, the law spoke its last word on Marcus Chen, declaring that some acts carried such weight that they defined a person's entire existence, that he would be remembered not for anything he might become, but for what he had done at 14, when he decided 3 strangers' lives mattered less than his curiosity about what it felt like to make them stop.